Allora, io introduco brevemente, faccio effettivamente una semplice introduzione perché la materia è specifica e verrà trattata quasi esclusivamente dai nostri corrispondenti esteri che verranno poi specificamente presentati con le relative competenze dal collega Lorenzo che coordinerà questa tavola rotonda di oggi. È un incontro ristretto, volutamente ristretto, perché l'interesse verso il mercato nordamericano è un interesse, anche se il Nord America rimane il principale mercato di sbocco dei prodotti italiani, e anche la percentuale di esportazione generale che si attesta a una delle più alte. Tuttavia le caratteristiche, le modalità per l'intervento in questa area commerciale è particolare, per cui è riservata ad aziende che hanno certe caratteristiche o certi progetti. Intendiamo ovviamente di progetti più complessi perché tutti possono vendere in Nord America, ma fare quello che intendiamo esporre noi oggi, cioè creare una struttura di penetrazione costante, continuativa e significativa nel mercato nordamericano, richiede invece un'applicazione diversa e l'utilizzo di sistemi, norme particolari. La mia è un'introduzione che può apparire in un certo senso banale, inutile, ma quello che voglio dare, invece il senso che voglio dare è il senso della necessità di un'impostazione strategica delle operazioni internazionali, sempre più in considerazione dell'incremento di una serie di complessità nell'operare a livello internazionale. E a questo proposito io intendo sempre distinguere le complessità dalle difficoltà. La difficoltà può avere dei limiti, può porre dei limiti, la complessità invece è un concetto matematico che indica la complessità come il rapporto che si crea quando devono essere coordinate più variabili. Quando ci sono due variabili da combinare c'è un livello di complessità, quando ci sono 8-10 variabili da combinare la complessità, il livello di complessità aumenta. Questo è il fenomeno che avviene da chi ha seguito l'internazionalizzazione da 20 anni a questa parte, sa che originariamente c'erano 2-3 complessità da combinare, oggi ce ne sono 10, 15, 20, eccetera. E questo è il concetto che vogliamo far passare. E per introdurre questo concetto, per capire questo concetto, richiamiamo alcune situazioni. Siamo in uno stato, il contesto globale, i contesti globali, questo contesto globale che cambia, varia di giorno in giorno, diremmo. Attualmente ci stiamo muovendo in un contesto globale di trade war, termine risaputo. Trade war che vede come concorrenti, combattenti, contrapposti principalmente questi quattro poli: Stati Uniti, Russia, Cina e l'Europa. Questo è uno stato di fatto di cui noi dobbiamo prendere cognizione, prendere atto e con quale dobbiamo agire. Le armi di questo trade war sono i dazi, le sanzioni, l'ingerenza dell'intelligence, l'intelligenza artificiale. Non c'è bisogno che vi spieghi quanto e come farà la differenza nel futuro, il predominio tecnologico che è il risultato finale di quel continente o quella potenza economica che riuscirà attraverso la tecnologia, l'intelligenza artificiale e anche attraverso una serie di soluzioni politiche o di decisioni, comportamenti politici come dazi e sanzioni, riuscirà comunque a assicurarsi un predominio tecnologico sul mercato mondiale. E in questo senso dobbiamo dire anche che gli Stati Uniti d'America oggi soffrono, noi vediamo quello che ci passa per le notizie più diffuse, ma sostanzialmente il problema che preme prevalentemente agli Stati Uniti e che poi si esprime in questi provvedimenti nell'utilizzo di queste armi della trade war è proprio un rischio in questo momento di perdere il predominio tecnologico del mercato mondiale nei confronti della Cina, perché ci sono delle procedure di sviluppo di tecnologia determinante in cui la Cina è a uno stadio più avanzato. I dazi, sapete tutti, è una materia come questa, non devo spiegare in cosa consistono, l'imposizione di una cassa daziaria all'interno non serve, una volta serviva semplicemente per proteggere l'economia interna, oggi generano ancora quell'effetto, ma è l'effetto minore, è appunto usato effettivamente come arma per contrastare lo sviluppo internazionale di altre nazioni. Le sanzioni ancora di più nascono da una reazione pressoché ritorsiva o deterrente nei confronti di alcuni stati, ma poi sostanzialmente si materializzano in una limitazione notevolissima degli scambi internazionali. L'embargo nei confronti dell'Iran taglia fuori direttamente un'area di mercato molto interessante. Le sanzioni nei confronti di certi paesi, nei confronti della Russia in particolare, generano problemi molto consistenti. Noi abbiamo alcuni clienti, grosse aziende, e tra queste non svelo niente se dico Profibras ad esempio, che utilizza prevalentemente alluminio e con la quale siamo in contatto quasi giornaliero per verificare i provvedimenti americani, l'evoluzione dei provvedimenti americani, la reazione delle multinazionali dell'alluminio, la reazione delle banche, perché bisogna combinare una serie di cose per trovare la multinazionale che ti fornisce l'alluminio e che non è inserita nell'embargo nominativo delle società embargate, ma poi bisogna trovare anche la banca che ti fa la transazione, perché sono movimenti da milioni per ogni ordine, quindi devi trovare anche la banca che ti fa l'operazione e i problemi sono non di te. Questa è la complessità, le sanzioni le abbiamo dette, questa è la complessità, la nuova complessità della internazionalizzazione. È una complessità, come abbiamo detto, dobbiamo combinare un numero di variabili superiori a quelle che combinavamo 10, 20 o 30 anni fa. Però questo contesto evidenzia anche quali debbono essere le skills dell'imprenditoria o di chi opera per l'imprenditoria, come ci inseriamo noi come studio legale internazionale di consulenza di internazionalizzazione, quali devono essere le skills per realizzare un progetto di internazionalizzazione o per supportare come consulenti, come prestatori, un progetto di internazionalizzazione. E queste skills debbono risolvere le difficoltà sia interne, non più solo quelle interne relative al prodotto, al processo produttivo, la presentazione del prodotto, eccetera, ma anche le difficoltà esterne al processo di internazionalizzazione, queste di cui parliamo, e quindi è molto importante arrivare a fare un utilizzo strategico ed appropriato di quelle disposizioni internazionali contenute nei trattati internazionali. Ecco di cosa parleremo oggi. Come adottare una soluzione strategica. Non possiamo più limitarci alle attività tattiche di vendita o di esportazione. Adottare una progettualità strategicamente impostata, studiata, collegata a tutte le leve che possono influire sul buon risultato dell'internazionalizzazione. In questo senso permettetemi, permettetemi di concludere. Ho già detto, gli imprenditori, qui siamo in presenza di imprenditori di manager, non vogliamo insegnare agli imprenditori cosa devono fare, noi vogliamo supportare ciò che gli imprenditori sanno fare e decidono di fare, raccomandando che nella loro progettazione inseriscano necessariamente una valenza strategica, perché la valenza tattica di andare a vendere all'estero non ha più nessun significato, e ovviamente consapevolizzandoci noi come struttura consulenziale sulla necessità di fornire all'azienda, anche da parte nostra, un supporto strategico. Io ho partecipato una settimana fa a Milano a un seminario di una giornata organizzato da ASLA, che è l'Associazione Studi Legali Associati, Associazione degli Studi Legali di Impresa, dove noi siamo un piccolo studio rispetto ai grossi studi di Milano. Nelle Marche siamo un grosso studio, lì siamo un piccolo studio. La differenza, quello che diciamo sempre, la differenza è quantitativa. Lo riteniamo, lo constatiamo, che è così, nel senso che con 16 avvocati nel nostro studio facciamo la stessa cosa che fanno gli studi legali di 100-200 avvocati, ovviamente la facciamo in 16, la facciamo nel nostro territorio, la facciamo per le nostre aziende del territorio. E dicevo, in questa riunione, Diritto al futuro, il titolo di questa giornata di studio, Diritto al futuro, si è concentrato proprio specificamente, prevalentemente, sulla evoluzione degli studi legali, dello studio legale di impresa e del servizio che lo studio legale di impresa deve fornire all'imprenditore in funzione dell'attività dell'imprenditore. Questa evoluzione è un'evoluzione di natura strategica. Queste parole abusate possono non avere nessun significato fino al momento in cui non la estrinsechiamo. Possiamo pronunciare la parola voto, oppure la possiamo pronunciare come tutte le lavorazioni in termini aziendali, li possiamo pronunciare appropriatamente quando gli conferiamo un contenuto che è un contenuto utile e utilizzabile. Allora, cosa vuol dire consulenza strategica? È questo. Noi come studio legale e come esperti in materia di internazionalizzazione possiamo limitarci a mettere in compliance l'operazione del cliente, e proprio in questa altra slide ho fatto questa differenza. Come consulenti legali l'impresa ci chiama e dice: devo fare un contratto di trasferimento di tecnologia, devo fare un contratto di joint venture. Ok, allora partiamo dalla parte contrattualistica, dobbiamo fare il contratto riguardo a rispondere alle norme internazionali sull'eggetto, ok, poi quindi mettiamo in conformità legale e contrattuale, poi dobbiamo verificare il raccordo fiscale tra la fiscalità italiana e la fiscalità del paese estero, quindi dobbiamo ragionare in termini di compliance alla fiscalità internazionale. Poi devi iniziare a trasferire beni, prodotti, macchinari, operazioni eccetera, c'è una compliance di natura doganale delle operazioni internazionali. Poi se purtroppo una incidenza c'è di patologia, sorge una patologia, ti dobbiamo assistere in un contenzioso internazionale che è totalmente diverso dal contenzioso nazionale e quindi richiede l'applicazione di normative e di pratiche processuali diverse. Spesso il contenzioso internazionale è arbitrale, quindi è diverso dal processo davanti a un giudice, e allora io ti assisto in un'attività che diventa tattica, ti metto in conformità legale tutte le operazioni, e questa è un'attività che lo studio legale di consulenza internazionale deve fare, ma limitandoci a questo è un po' come se l'azienda continua ad andare a vendere i prodotti. Sì, continua a fare il prodotto buono per quel mercato, crea i comunicazionali, continua a vendere i prodotti, ma l'evoluzione futura, quel nuovo contesto globale che si evolve di giorno in giorno, richiede invece un intervento da parte nostra, ma vedetelo sempre affrontato, richiede da parte dell'azienda, come vi ho già detto, un approccio e una progettualità di natura strategica, non più solo tattica. Produco, faccio un prodotto adatto, vado a vendere. No, devo trovare delle soluzioni strategiche che mi permettono di acquisire un vantaggio competitivo rispetto alla concorrenza, se no andiamo a vendere tutti, vendiamo tutti i prodotti e via. Avete tutti i prodotti eccellenti, ma sul mercato il consumatore non so quanto distingue l'eccellenza, sì, prodotti molto tecnologici particolari, però in generale quanto distingue. Non basta, voglio dire che non basta più. Allora dobbiamo trovare soluzioni strategiche, l'impresa deve trovare soluzioni strategiche per posizionarsi, occupare spazi, creare vantaggi competitivi, e non continuo perché per voi dico stupidaggini, dico ovvietà, non stupidaggini, cose serie, ma dico ovvietà. E quindi dovete evolvere la pianificazione e la gestione aziendale in termini strategici, con la capacità di adeguarvi e bypassare qualsiasi variabile nuova che interviene. Analogamente noi come consulenti non possiamo limitarci più a fare i consulenti legali, siamo bravi legali, ammesso che siamo bravi legali, facciamo una buona consulenza legale, va bene, ottimo, ma non basta più questo nemmeno per noi. Se voi dovete fare quel tragitto, noi dobbiamo supportarvi in quel tragitto. Qual è il tragitto? Dobbiamo diventare da consulenti legali consulenti di impresa. Consulenti di impresa significa che partecipiamo alla generazione del progetto, alla impostazione del progetto, alla riuscita del progetto. E allora dobbiamo contribuire a generare le operazioni di internazionalizzazione, contribuire a ridurre e rimuovere gli ostacoli all'internazionalizzazione, cioè dobbiamo contribuire ad arrivare all'obiettivo. Allora, qual è l'obiettivo che analizziamo oggi? Il mercato nordamericano. Il mercato nordamericano, e in particolare il mercato USA, è un mercato molto promettente, ma è un mercato sofisticato. Sentiremo oggi parlare di visti, basta, e questa è una delle materie che noi trattiamo da 15-20 anni a questa parte. All'inizio era una cosa, no? Così brava, marginale e determinante. Già la difficoltà di individuare, prima ancora di ottenere un visto, individuare qual è il visto che serve per la vostra operazione, ottenerlo, questo è un esempio della complessità. Poi vediamo che di giorno in giorno intervengono provvedimenti o proiezioni di provvedimenti, minacce di provvedimenti che ci attempivano e ci rendono sempre più difficoltoso, più preoccupante l'approccio a questo mercato, l'approccio diretto al mercato USA. Ora, poiché noi dobbiamo arrivare in USA, principalmente in USA, dobbiamo capire come strategicamente trovare la soluzione. È un po' un piano strategico di battaglia, no? Facciamo intervenire la cavalleria da destra nel momento in cui passiamo dietro la collina e rispuntiamo di fronte allo schieramento nemico. Permettetemi queste esemplificazioni. Allora, una delle soluzioni possibili che vi verranno esplicate oggi è che noi abbiamo messo a punto, rilevando un numero di nostri clienti che ci hanno fatto richiesta, un numero di nostri clienti, alcuni sono qui presenti, ci hanno fatto richiesta di come, e quindi abbiamo messo a punto questa tavola rotonda di oggi, e a tale scopo abbiamo invitato 2 avvocati canadesi, 2 avvocati americani, come per penetrare il mercato USA e dal mercato USA al mercato messicano, passando per il Canada, fruendo delle disposizioni del trattato CETA. Ecco il modo, l'utilizzo di norme che diventa un utilizzo strategico. C'è strategia a voglia nelle normative, nell'utilizzo, nell'identificazione di normative, disposizioni, eccetera, che può essere combinato con la strategia e la pianificazione aziendale. Come quindi arrivare a penetrare questo mercato nordamericano passando per il Canada e fruendo delle disposizioni del trattato CETA. Questo è tutto. Prima di passare la parola e dare inizio ai lavori veri e propri, voglio ricordare che nella cartellina c'è una scheda, disposizione logistica. Vi preghiamo prima del
come punto di approdo per poi gestire, oltre che il mercato canadese, anche altri mercati limitrofi e storicamente legati tra di loro, come ad esempio quello degli Stati Uniti e del Messico. Questo vedremo in considerazione del fatto che esistono anche qui storicamente degli accordi che legano i mercati nordamericani. Facciamo riferimento ad accordi di libero scambio, quindi che facilitano lo scambio e il commercio tra questi paesi, e facciamo riferimento e utilizziamo ovviamente una recente novità normativa che è appunto rappresentata dal trattato di libero scambio denominato CETA, che è stato nel 2017 messo in funzionamento. Era stato già negoziato come scritto prima, ma l'applicazione e l'efficacia decorre dal 2017, dall'estate del 2017, quindi questo è il primo momento utile per trarre qualche considerazione e sviluppare qualche tipo di strategia utilizzando quindi le normative evolute di cui disponiamo oggi. La mattina i lavori sono stati suddivisi in questo modo. Inizieremo con, come diceva l'avvocato Bacciardi, abbiamo al tavolo un numero di relatori che sono stati ovviamente invitati e tratteranno la materia in una certa progressione, che a nostro avviso è una progressione utile per comprendere complessivamente le strategie che possono essere sviluppate. Partiremo con una presentazione che illustra i vantaggi e le facilitazioni che il nuovo trattato CETA tra Unione Europea e Canada fornisce alle imprese italiane, e lo tratteremo principalmente in questa prima presentazione i vantaggi di natura commerciale, quindi quali sono le facilitazioni dal punto di vista di azzeramento dei dazi o degli oneri di confine nella nella compravendita delle merci, nella movimentazione delle merci e anche nella liberalizzazione di certi settori del mercato canadese, dove le imprese italiane oggi hanno la possibilità di accedere. Una tra tutti, ad esempio, è la possibilità di partecipare ad appalti governativi per la fornitura o la prestazione di servizi. Poi passeremo a vedere, ad analizzare ancora il trattato CETA, ma con riferimento a vantaggi e facilitazioni che vengono affrontate a favore dell'impresa italiana, laddove l'impresa italiana debba movimentare personale manageriale o personale che abbia la funzione di sviluppare i rapporti commerciali, oppure addirittura gestire le attività imprenditoriali che l'impresa potrebbe avere intenzione o aver già realizzato nel territorio canadese. Quindi vediamo quali sono le facilitazioni dal punto di vista di movimentazione internazionale e di immigrazione per motivi di business nel territorio canadese. Completeremo quindi la prima fase parlando poi sempre di Canada, cercando di chiudere un po' l'analisi, spiegando quelli che sono, al di là del trattato multilaterale di libero scambio, quali sono le caratteristiche principali del Canada in termini di doing business, e quindi nel senso di le migliori strategie da adottare per costituire una forma di presenza commerciale e imprenditoriale all'interno del territorio canadese. Probabilmente ci fermeremo per un break a questo punto e rinizieremo dopo il break con un'analisi invece degli aspetti più statunitensi, con i colleghi che invece trattano la parte relativa agli Stati Uniti. Tratteremo sia la parte relativa alla business immigration, quindi alla movimentazione dei lavoratori verso gli Stati Uniti, con le varie soluzioni di immigrazione per motivi di business, e tratteremo anche gli aspetti più operativi, anche qui di gestione del business negli Stati Uniti. Chiuderemo poi la mattinata con una relazione finale che tratterà proprio i trattati di libero scambio che intercorrono tra il Canada e i paesi nordamericani, per completare i ragionamenti e diciamo, chiarire quella che è la visione strategica dell'ingresso delle imprese in Canada, per poi, sfruttando questi trattati preesistenti, gestire i mercati, commercialmente parlando, gestire i mercati americani e i mercati messicani. E questo sarà il confrontamento dei lavori. Ora, prima di iniziare, consentitemi, voi sapete che le relazioni verranno principalmente svolte in inglese, anzi esclusivamente svolte in inglese. Qualora vi sia la necessità, io avrei la funzione poi di svolgere un brevissimo summary di ciascun intervento, per dare un po' un sunto in lingua italiana, qualora sia utile per voi per completare la comprensione. Però chiederò principalmente a voi se la relazione è stata sufficientemente chiara. Qualora lo sia, andremo avanti. Diversamente farò un breve inciso per illustrare e spiegare meglio gli aspetti che sono stati trattati in inglese. A questo punto direi di passare. Sì, ovviamente gli. Yes, this is working. Yes.
Oh, we can't fit on. Can we shrink that a little bit to get it? Maybe do it to 7?
I think we cannot do that from here. Probably we have to adjust the projector. Okay, we'll have the IT manager doing the adjustment.
So, good morning, my name is Isabella Butani. I would have tried my Italian, but I did that yesterday and it didn't go over very well. So, even though I am of Italian origin, I was born in Canada. So, thank you for joining us. There we go. So, I apologize. I'm going to try and shrink that a little bit so that it fits on one screen. So, as Lorenzo mentioned, I will be speaking a little bit about the economy of Canada itself and the relationship between Canada and Italy that they've had to date. We'll then talk a little bit about CETA, and from there, I will then, when I come back, talk about doing business in Canada, and then finally on how to use CETA as a gateway to the North American market. I'm going to get this wrong the whole time. So I'm actually not a lawyer, I'm an accountant. I'm with RSM Canada. My office in Toronto is, we have about 300 people, 40 partners, and we are globally in 120 countries, and we have about 41,000, I had to look that up, 41,000 professionals and 800 offices worldwide. We offer a number of services, including accounting, tax, consulting, so a wide range of services. And our focus is essentially middle market type clients. I'm going to do this all day. I liked my clicker yesterday. One of the things that I do is I work with foreign-held companies that are in other jurisdictions like Italy that want to advance into the Canadian market. We have a soft landing program where we help them with all aspects, including assisting them connect with other specialties that don't need, such as speaking on immigration issues. So why Canada? Oh, sorry. Not waiting for your attention. What is that? Hello? No, I think I just didn't have any more. I was having such trouble with this thing. So why Canada? So the Canadian population, and I'm hoping I can read these words, we haven't shrunk this yet, is 36.5 million people. The economy is $2.13 trillion, and per capita 57,000, so GDP. I can't even see that. You can't move that over, right?
Exports.
Yeah, it's exports, yeah. So exports are 628 million and imports 676 billion. So as you can see, it is quite a great economy in Canada, and definitely a market that people want to. As an economy, it is. Oh wait, should we wait to see if we can shrink this a little bit?
Dobbiamo fare entrare la slide.
So that they can see. So. I think we just have to shrink it to 75%. There we go. Okay. All right, there we go. So according to the World Bank, it is the easiest place to start a business. You can incorporate a company within 2 days. There's free trade agreements covering 40 countries, so very open to trade and a very talented workforce. We are also very diversified country. 1 in 5 Canadians speak one of 200 languages, so very diversified. One of the things about Canada is we are very open to immigration, so you are going to have be in one city, but be in a very diverse multicultural city, so everybody is identifiable in that way. We have one of the strongest financial sectors, and 5 of our banks are in the top 10 of North America, and 2 of them are in the top 20. within the world. So we have a number of incentives and a very talented workforce. So some of the key industry sector advantages of Canada: aerospace, automotive, advanced manufacturing, life sciences, agri-food processing, film and digital media, technology, energy, financial services, mining. These are some of the major sectors within Canada. There's others like forestry and such. I think, is everyone, I was reading sort of through who's here, you mostly in manufacturing? What are some of the industries?
The core business in the region is divided between the different provinces. So we have, in the northern part, we have furniture, we have mechanics and little mechanics in the sense nearby Ancona province. In the south, and then we have more textile, leather, and that's how we spread it out.
So everybody here is kind of representing those regions. Okay, so we'll be able to, I think, connect on some of them in terms of what we'll be talking about. So just in terms of what Italy and Canada, the relationship, Italy is Canada's 12th largest export destination, and they rank 8th in the world and 3rd largest in Europe as a source of imports. So quite an important relationship. There are exports to Italy at 2.3 billion and imports to Canada from Italy of 7.5 billion. So again, quite an important relationship. I thought it was interesting to look, just based on the industries that you're involved in, to kind of lay out what the top 10 exports to Italy are and what the top 10 imports from Italy are. So boilers, machinery, mechanical appliances is number 1 from what gets imported from Italy. Beverages, vehicles, pharmaceutical products, optical and medical instruments, furniture, which was one of the items that you sounded excited. Footwear, I actually thought footwear would be number 1, but just because I buy a lot of Italian shoes, but it's number 7, and perfumes, cosmetics, and organic. And some similar on the other side, but definitely some things where you don't have that. So I wanted to give you a couple of definitions before we started speaking about CETA, just so that as we're talking about it, you have a good understanding of that. So a tariff is the duty that you're paying on a particular class of goods, imports or exports, and a quota is when the amount of that good is restricted by the government in terms of what can be imported or exported during a particular period of time. So with CETA, you'll see that a number of different classifications have been given some quotas. And it's to regulate the trade between the countries and protect very sensitive industries for a country. So the CETA agreement, the Canadian-European Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, came into force September 21st. It was a provisional application. That means that not everything has been signed yet, but it is in fact in force. More than 98% of the Canadian tariff lines have become duty-free, and another 1% will be phased out within the next 5 to 7 years. One of the important things to note is proof of origin. So the rules of origin, meaning where the product originated, is very important in terms of whether or not the goods will qualify for the tariff-free designation, and a declaration of origin is required by the exporter. So that's something that has to be done here before you're exporting your goods to make sure you qualify. And then, as I mentioned, a limited number of goods are qualified under that have less demanding rules. Many sectors that, from a Canadian perspective, that are benefiting are agriculture, forest products, fish, seafood, automotive. Sorry, so some of the major areas of CETA are the openness of the procurement process. So if the procurement in terms of government procurement has been opened much broadly. So if you are looking at a government contract from Italy that is in Canada and you want to apply, there's now a process that you can go and apply for that. do a bid or a tender for that particular project. So for example, if you are in, for example, creating a boiler systems, and you know that certain hospitals have been put out a contract for that, you should be able, under the new system, to apply for that procurement. The other thing which Stephen Green will speak about, and Christina in a little while, is the ease of mobility now. Through CETA, they've made the provisions much easier for companies to send their employees back and forth to work on their work in other countries. Oh, I skipped over that. Customs and trade facilitation, there's going to be much easier. They're putting together a program that is much easier to communicate on customs matters. They're supposed to be putting in a system for addressing complaints and simplifying border compliance rules. As well, regulatory. One of the things that they are ensuring good regulatory practice, they're making sure that there is protection of patents in place and other factors so that industries are protected. So pharmaceutical is not one of them. And then finally, which is really important because this was one of the things that people felt didn't allow other trade agreements, particularly with Italy, to work in the past, is the geographical indicators and trademarks. So for example, in Italy, you have Parmigiano Reggiano, which is a protected way of describing the cheese in the area. And so in Canada, they've expanded this list to add another 179 agricultural products and food originating in Europe. So in Canada, nobody else can call Parmigiano Reggiano that unless it's originating from that region. Other things are champagne, for example, from France and a few other things. The other thing is there are some investment provisions. They have been relaxed a bit. The threshold review has been increased. So in terms of the amount of investment, one of the things though is there are other regulatory bodies when you're coming into Canada that will be reviewing if you are in a specific industry. So for example, if you're in communications, there is another regulatory body called the CRTC that will review if you are in a competitive industry. So if you hear on the news that one company was looking to take over another company, and they said the government has stopped that takeover, it's because it was in a protected industry. Military is another one that would be reviewed closely. So I want to talk about the rules of origin as well. So the rules of origin, as I mentioned, are about where the product originated so that it falls under the CETA program. So the products have to have had sufficient production either in the EU or Canada in order to be in that tariff-free definition. There is a listing, so what I would say in terms of what you're doing in your particular industry is you can actually go into the website, look up the listing, and find out what you would be if the tariff has been reduced or removed, and what the provisions are. And again, it sets out rules for the products containing imported materials to specify the maximum percentage that can be derived from other than the EU or Canada. So for example, one of the areas is textile. So if you're making shirts and you're importing your fabric from a country outside of the EU and then you are bringing it into Italy and you're sewing it and applying the buttons and everything else, that is one industry where they need to review these limits in terms of determining what is the maximum value in order to see whether it can apply for the reduced quotas. And the fashion industry is one that not always gets that benefit because of the way the movement of the goods are. The other thing is there are a number of industries where they have applied quotas. So the quotas in terms of how many of a certain item can you bring in and not be limited to that specific percentage required to be made in the EU or Canada. textiles is one of them. So the quotas have to be applied for, and then you can import some of those goods, even though the percentage is not met under the rules of origin. Fish, seafood, certain agricultural products, passenger vehicles as well are another one. So to summarize, so you've got the tariffs that you're paying, you've got to meet the rules of origin, but if you don't, you could fall in an industry that is a quota, and you can take a quota or apply for a quota and then be able to ship under the provisions of CETA without meeting that, meeting the rules of origin. But again, there's certain numbers. So again, I just went through this about the sensitive areas. So, and again, it's because they want to protect these industries. And so they're listed out here: textiles, automotive, fish and seafood, and such. Again, a few more. These are the tariffs are being phased out, but there are quotas in place for these after a certain amount of times. This is in the agriculture and food. And again, a tariff rate quota also established for beef, pork, bison, sweet corn, and common wheat. Dairy products. Do we have a lot of farming in this area? Is it common? No. In town home, yes. Yes. Yeah. So dairy products was one of the areas that held up the finalization of CETA. It was supposed to be provisional in July, and they moved it in September. And the reason was there was a dispute with the dairy farmers in terms of how many quotas would be allowed. It's a very protected industry, so it's even part of the dispute in terms of the NAFTA discussions between Canada and the U.S. One of the things about quotas and protected industries and the rules of origin is I was having a discussion with someone who was in the automotive industry, and the rules of origin discussions are so contentious that he, maybe said, do you have to see where the dinosaur died in order to determine where the oil came from to see if it meets the rules of origins? They're becoming that detail. Again, this is more of that there. So automotive, as I mentioned, is one of these. So if you're in manufacturing and are even manufacturing parts related to the automotive industry and are supplying that, the manufacturing aspect has become pretty much tariff-free. However, if you are in the actual passenger vehicle manufacturer, there's been quotas that have been applied. So there are 50% originating content. That's now what you need to meet the rules of origin. It's increasing, but there are 100,000 of those being allowed where there is less than that. And this is just more about that sector. Just a little bit about the procurement rules. So as we talked a little bit about this before, so again, in terms of public tenders, so in Europe you have the TED system, which is the tenders electronic dealing. There's something similar in Canada in terms of looking up all the contracts that are available online in terms of public tenders, so you are able to go online. So this was always available, that foreign companies could go in and apply for a public tender, but now it has been expanded to include hospitals, local governments, health boards, and as well as increased now right to the municipal level as opposed to just at a federal level. Do we have any questions? I went through that pretty quickly.
Yeah. Can we share the same presentation, please?
Oh, yes. So if you want a copy of the presentation, and it's my fault because I was supposed to send it to Lorenzo by a certain date, and I didn't. So he cut me off on including me in the package. So if you'd like a copy of the presentation, just leave me your business card and I will email it to you. So it's in a few sections, so we'll be talking.
We will also send it to everyone right after the meeting. So.
There we go. So, does anyone have any questions
pass it on to Mr. Seabury.
Sul presupposto che non ci siano necessità di chiarimento, eviteremmo quindi il summary in italiano. Comprendo che comunque siete abbastanza autonomi con la cognizione della lingua, quindi se questa è la situazione passiamo alla seconda relazione trattando gli aspetti di mobilità internazionale dei manager. Okay, so Steven, there's no need for me to translate and summarize in Italian because the audience is fully conversant with English, so we can move on with the second presentation.
Good morning. So what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about how you can enter Canada under the right type of documents so that you can perhaps start your business, expand your business. But before I start, I think it's important to let you know the environment of what's going on in Canada now with respect to immigration and businesses. The Canadian government recognized about 2 years ago what was starting to happen in our friends south of us, the United States, with their immigration policy. And we recognized that there were going to be big changes there, or possible changes. So we thought about a way to attract businesses and people to come to Canada. And what we did was we tried to develop a concierge service, make it easier for people to come and work in Canada. It kind of reminded me of when I used to go to Singapore, and I'd go to immigration, and they'd say, "Welcome to Singapore," and they would offer you a candy. Well, Canada now is not offering candies, but we're doing things a little better to help businesses. And we recently were involved in moving a company from the US to Canada because they were very concerned about losing their skilled workers that worked for them in the United States because they weren't sure how they were going to be able to extend their permits. So our visa sections have become very busy. India, one of the busiest for us, 2 Thursdays ago received 4,100 applications for people to either visit, study, or work in Canada. Our student visas have gone like this. Our work permit applications have gone like this. So we think we have succeeded a little bit on making it easier to come to Canada. So what I'm going to talk about today is who can come, who can't come, and how we can use our immigration system to help you expand, make more money for you, more jobs for us, more taxes for us. So it's a win-win for everybody. Who cannot come to Canada? Well, we have enough criminals, so we don't want any more criminals. In Canada, we have free medicine. So it's a very important aspect when you are determining the cost of expanding. Our medicine is free. In the United States, people have to pay for medicine, so that's an expense to employees. But in Canada, our medicine is free. So if you get a work permit, within 90 days of arriving, you have the same health care as me. So it's quite good as far as that, and you can't, as I said, pay for health care. But what we did introduce recently from a security standpoint is something called an ETA. And what an ETA is you basically go online, pay the Canadian government $7, And they kind of check you out a little bit to make sure that you don't have a criminal record and you're the kind of person we want to come and visit or work. So everybody now, except for American citizens, must pay this $7. Otherwise, you cannot get on the airplane. You could drive, but you can't get on the airplane. So it's important, if you're coming for business meetings to explore the market in Canada, you pay your $7 because at the airport you will have a big problem. The trade agreement that we entered into in September of last year with Europe is quite helpful. And all of the European governments and the Canadian governments are really trying to make it a success because the governments, some of them are quite concerned that there's a lot of nationalism happening in so many countries. So they want to show that with free trade, the agreement, it works well and it's very profitable for both places. So the CETA agreement, we have various categories, and one of the interesting ones is the business visitor. This is for someone who wants to come to Canada, wants to explore what's happening, gets one of those $7 ETAs, and comes and their hands are in their pockets. They're not allowed to work. You can visit, meet, learn, but you can't work most of the time. But for individuals that are involved in selling products to Canada, it's very important that in that contract of the goods that are going to be sold, the products that are going to be sold, you put a little paragraph in your agreement that says that you're going to provide perhaps training on the goods, guaranteed work if it breaks down, because if you put that clause in, you will be able to send your workers to Canada who can take their hands out of their pockets just by visiting. So it's very, very important that you have that in your contract. If you don't, then it becomes difficult for you to service your clients. Also, if you sell goods, perhaps marble, furniture, and you need to install this in the Canadian customer, if that paragraph is not in your agreement, very, very difficult for your employee to take their hands out and fix things. And I guess Christina could talk a little bit about one situation that we worked with Lorenzo with respect to someone coming as a business person who could take their hands out and do some work.
Yeah, so a few months ago, we worked with one of Lorenzo's clients. They were manufacturing some very intricate marble pieces that was sold to a Canadian customer. So in working with Lorenzo, we were able to structure the purchase agreement in such a way where there was a very clear provision that the installation of the marble was part of the purchase. And as a result, we were able to bring over 6 or 7 workers, very specialized technicians that came in to install the marble pieces that were purchased by the Canadian customer. So in working with Lorenzo, we were able to put together packages for each of the 7 individuals that were then presented to the border officials. They took a quick look at it to make sure there was a contract. They looked at the contract to make sure that the contract had the very specific provision that Stephen was just talking about. They looked at the credentials to make sure that they were specialized trainers and installers. And they all entered Canada with ease. All they had to do was the ETA. They carried the packages that we prepared for them, and it was a very smooth transition.
And that was done really in one day. So they just showed up at the border. If Lorenzo had not put that clause to get those workers in, and we may not have been able to, because we would have had to show that there weren't any Canadians that could do that kind of work. But because of his advice, they were able to come in immediately, and his client was happy, and the Canadian has beautiful stuff. So the next group is the investor. If you want to come and you're looking at investing, opening up a business in Canada, you can use this provision to come and set up your business in Canada as an investor. You can bring your senior people with you. That application is done at the Canadian Embassy in Rome, and again, it's fairly straightforward where you would get a work permit to come and start your business. But another area in the CETA is called the intercompany transfer. If you want to open up an office inside of Canada, and you want to transfer people that are managers, executives, or have special knowledge of things that you do in your company, you can transfer these people to Canada for up to 3 years to begin, and perhaps even extend it longer. But an interesting part of the intercompany transfer is that under CETA, you can even send trainees under this program. So if you hire someone recently, they have a university degree, and that they've worked for you for at least 1 year, you can transfer them to get some experience abroad. And normally, under other provisions in immigration, that is not permitted, but in this special CETA agreement, it is. The next area of CETA is that if you sign a contract with a Canadian company and you are providing services to that Canadian company, those employees can come to Canada very easily. You don't have to test the market to see if there's other people. So for example, if you are an engineering consulting company and you sign a contract with a Canadian company, you can send your engineers to Canada and they can work. Also, if you are a self-employed person, meaning you perhaps do computer work, you're a financial expert, then you can also use the CETA agreement to come and enter Canada without testing are there Canadians available. Because normally, like in most countries, a foreign worker cannot come in unless you make sure there's no Italians that can do it here in Italy or no Canadians that can do it. So this really makes it easy for professionals to come into Canada, but they do go ahead and limit it into certain types of industries. So you see some are in the mining industry, if you're involved in mining, engineering, dealing with aircrafts, management consultants. So if you fall into those types of areas where you work, then you can enter Canada quite easily under CETA. Also, with respect to CETA, the Canadian government has set up about 4 weeks ago a special concierge service for businesses that want to use this agreement, and you can actually go online and the government of Canada will help you answer all of your questions in a general way. So it's very helpful, and if you really move forward with your plan, they will designate a government worker to help you with all kinds of questions. So again, we're trying our best to provide this service and encourage companies to expand. So that's really it with respect to this agreement. But we have other options if you don't fall under the CETA. So again, the business visitor is very similar. This is the regular immigration, not CETA. Again, the business visitor is very similar to CETA, where it's important that if you sell your goods, you put in that special contract and you can come to Canada as a visitor and work or for meetings. But it's important that if you're coming for business and business meetings, you should have documentation just in case the immigration officer at the border says, what are you doing? Why are you coming to Canada? How long are you staying? Well, are you just going to Niagara Falls, or are you really coming for a meeting? So you should have something like that on you to demonstrate that you're really coming as a visitor. And again, those are some of the things that visitors can do when they come. You can come and sell your goods in Canada. So if you are a furniture manufacturer, you are permitted to come into Canada, go see distributors. You can even sign contracts for the sales of those goods, but you must leave Canada and then the goods can come. They cannot be warehoused in Canada if you are coming to sell any form of goods. Intercompany transfers, again, very similar to the CETA, where you have a manager, executive, someone that has specialized knowledge, but there's no trainees under the normal intercompany transfer. And you get a work permit for 7 years if you are a manager, executive, and you get it for 5 years if you have specialized knowledge. How long is the process? Well, as an Italian national, if you said that you were going to transfer someone today, as long as they can use the computer fast, they can jump on the airplane and go to Canada now. There's no, you can process all of your work permits at the border for an intercompany transfer because you don't need a visa to enter Canada. Canada is a bilingual country, so we have French and we have English. Even though in Toronto, where I come from, as Isabella has said, we speak about 200 different languages. We have the second largest Italian population outside of Rome. We have 5 Chinatowns where the streets are written in Chinese. We have an Italian town, Portuguese, Greek. It's just amazing how many cultures we have. And unlike our friends south of the border, when you come to America, you go into this pot, we mix you up, and out comes America. We don't do that in Canada. We want you to teach us about your culture. So we very much promote this idea of multiculturalism. And you will find that if you do send employees to Canada, the diversity is amazing. As I said, we have a large Italian population, and if you go to our Italian area, you would think that no one speaks anything but Italian. Same thing if you go to our China, everything is like you're in Hong Kong. So it's quite amazing to see. But the government still wants to promote more multiculturalism. And every year, we take about 330,000 new immigrants. And remember, our population is only 36 million, second largest country in the world. We watch a little too much television, and we aren't having enough children. So we have to push our immigration up, but we want to promote French speaking in all parts of Canada besides Quebec. Quebec is very much French, but Ontario is not enough. So the government has said, anybody that can speak French can come to Canada and work in a skilled job. And you don't even have to have one of the job requirements is that you have to speak French in the job. So if I have a company and you can speak French, I give you a letter, hi, come, you speak French, great. But you don't have to speak French at work. As long as you speak French at home, no problem. And you get this work permit for a minimum of 3 years, and you can transfer over to immigration. So this is our French mobility program, and it's quite helpful, and hopefully we'll get more French-speaking individuals. And the government is so involved in this program that they're taking trips to French-speaking countries. I was just in Morocco, and beside me is the Canadian government telling other people, please come. So can you imagine a government going out and promoting people to move to their country? Another one of our programs is called reciprocal employment. And it's really for bigger companies. So if you work for a large company and you have offices all over the world or in a few places, and you transfer some people to America, you transfer some people to China, to Japan, if you can show that you have this mobility program, you don't have to test to see if there are Canadians that are available, and you can transfer people on the mobility program without testing if there are Canadians. So it's very, very good, this reciprocity they call it. If you can't figure out one of the easy ways to get into Canada with a work permit, this is the last resort. And that's the one where you must test the labor market. You must look at the Canadian population for a minimum of 4 weeks. After you've examined to see if there is a hotel manager available, and you say there's no good hotel managers in Canada, then you can try to bring a hotel manager from Italy. Or if you are a furniture manufacturer and you're looking for a specialized carpenter, you must try to find the carpenter for 4 weeks. If you can't find that carpenter, then you are permitted to bring that special worker to Canada. But it's an expensive process. The government charges employers $1,000 per worker to come. It's a long time. It's about a 3-month process. So it's difficult for companies, but this is the old style of bringing people into Canada that still exists, and a lot of companies are stuck using it. But because of the Canadian government's desire to make us a center for IT, artificial intelligence, and a center for skilled workers to really come and work, they created another program in June of 2014. And what this program is that if you are a skilled worker and a Canadian company wants you for a very short time, you can show up at the border and say, hi, I'm an engineer, I'm going to work in a Canadian company for a maximum of 30 days. You can come and take your hands out of your pocket and work as a visitor for up to 30 days once a year, no more. Or you can come for 15 days, take your hands out of your pocket, leave for 6 months, and come back again with your hands out of your pockets. So it's trying to help Canadian companies with a skill shortage of a skilled person and make it easy for this person to come in. And it's called our Global Skills Strategy. So we are looking for global skills. If you find them and you're coming for a short time, we will let you in easily. And it makes sense because you would have to use that old system of advertising for 4 weeks and pay $1,000. And if someone's only coming for a week, that's a lot of work for just a short time. So this is a great program that is available. And also you'll see that we want to encourage professors to come and do research. So if you're a professor at a university, you can come and do research in Canada and work, again, under this special global skills. But we want to do what India has done, what the United States did in Silicon Valley, what Israel has done in the IT area. So if you're an IT company and you want to hire some people that do these occupations in the computer area, you don't have to test the labor market. You still have to pay that $1,000, but you have to explain to the Canadian government that by bringing in this computer engineer, it's going to make our company better. You get that approval in 10 days. So if you are a computer company in Canada, any company in Canada, if I needed a computer engineer, I would get this approval in 10 days and my Italian national could enter in 10 days. So again, we're trying to help build the IT industries, and it's been working great. Companies love it. The government is really on top of this because they review the job list every year. So 1 year has just passed, they looked at it and they created a few more on this list. Now there's a big pressure from our banking industries because Canada, we have a huge service industry in the financial area, and there's a big shortage of economists and things like that. So the banks are trying to get banking jobs on this list where people can come in 10 days. So we'll see how that works. Maybe Christina can talk about how we encourage people to bring their families and how it's important, because a lot of times a skilled worker will say, I don't want to come unless my family can come with me. So who's included in the family?
So, as Stephen said, if you come to Canada, if you're coming to Canada to work for 6 months or longer, you don't have to come alone. Your family can come with you, so your spouse, whether you're married or in a common law relationship for 1 year for immigration purposes. So, common law for immigration purposes is that you live together for 1 year continuously. Your spouse can come to Canada with you. So, let's say you've been transferred to Canada on a 2-year work permit. Your spouse is eligible for a 2-year open work permit, meaning they can work at any company or anywhere they like in Canada. And your children, as long as they're under the ages of 22, are eligible to get a study permit, so they can attend school, the publicly funded schools in Canada, and have Canadian education. And as Stephen had mentioned earlier, when we're dealing with inadmissibility issues, the worker, as long as, so you and your family, as long as you're here for 3 months, you're eligible for health care in Canada. So you're able to get an OIM card, so let's say you get sick and you have to go to the doctor, to the hospital, just like me and Stephen, that we're able to go to the doctor, you and your family will be able to go as well. But what you have to keep in mind is it's your immediate family, so it's only spouses and dependent children. Parents and stuff like that would have to come on their own or as visitors to Canada.
And if you come with your children and they're going to primary and secondary school, it's free. So you can imagine you come on a work permit and the government pays for your children to go to school. University, we're not that nice, you have to pay for that. But otherwise, it's pretty good for the dependent children, primary and secondary school, and our health care. This is sort of a little chart. It's hard to see, but when we send out the materials, it just kind of goes through, do I need a work permit? Can I come as a visitor? And you can look at it quickly to see how it works. But as I said, the nicest thing about our system is that we can really tailor the immigration system to you. People come into my office and they say, oh, Stephen, should I do this so immigration thinks this, or should I do that? I say, no, stop. Do what's good for you and your business, and we will make the system work for you. So that's really nice in our immigration system. Immigration. So if you do fall in love with us and you want to stay longer than a work permit, we have an immigration system. And historically, our immigration system for workers was really bad and slow. We used to let anyone apply for immigration if you did a skilled job. We used to have a list of 1,881 occupations, and if you did one of those occupations, you could apply for immigration. I mean, some of them were ridiculous. We had a puzzle maker on this list. We had a beer taster. I guess we drink a lot of beer in Canada. I don't know. But there were so many people that applied that it took about 6 to 7 years in some countries. So the previous government said, this is ridiculous, let's cancel the program. So they canceled that program, Some people were quite upset because they waited like 4 years or 5 years, and the government said, here's your money back. So anyway, they did it, and they came up with a new program, and it's called Express Entry. We want to get you here really fast. So if you go, they look at your age, your education, do you have family in Canada, have you ever studied in Canada, have you ever worked in Canada, and if you have the right stuff, you get invited. The government is able to process these 2,000 to 3,000 applications every 2 weeks to 3 weeks in 6 months. So it's amazing that you apply for immigration and you get it in 6 months. And lately, they're really doing it in about 3 to 4 months. So it's quite fast for people, and I think it's a great idea because you're meeting the needs of the labor market very quickly, not 6, 7 years from now, because things change like that. So that's our express entry type of system. Once you get your immigration to Canada, your Canadian green card, we call it a make-believe card, there are residency requirements, meaning that you have to stay in Canada for a bit of time. So if I became an immigrant today, I get a make-believe card that's good for 5 years. In the 5 years, I must live in Canada for at least 2 years accumulative. So in the 5, I can be away in Italy doing business for 3 years, no problem. So it's quite lenient, and there are even exceptions to the 2-year requirement that you don't have to live in Canada. So I think we've got a pretty good program to keep your immigration. Citizenship. The world thanks Italy with respect to Canadian citizenship. Why? Prior to 1977, the government of Canada did not permit dual citizenship. You had to give up your citizenships if you wanted to become a Canadian. And as I said before, we have a huge Italian population. Most of the immigration from Italy came in the 60s, in late 50s. And the problem was that so many Italians were immigrating. The politicians wanted them to vote, but they couldn't vote because to become eligible to vote, you had to be a citizen. And there was no way that Italians were going to give up their passport. So the government looked at it for about 10 years and said, whoa, we want votes. So they changed the law, February 14th, today is Valentine's Day, a love day, 1977, permitting as many passports as you wish. So now you can keep your Italian passports, you can keep going and keep going, as many as you wanted. You can get a Canadian one. To become a Canadian citizen, you must physically live in Canada for 3 out of 5 years. You must be able to speak English or French, but if you're over 55, you don't have to speak English or French. You have to do a test on who the Prime Minister is and so on and so forth. But of course, if you're over 55, we don't really need you to do any tests, and then you become a Canadian citizen. One of the greatest advantages from a financial perspective is that if you become a Canadian citizen and decide to go abroad, leave Canada, you don't pay us any tax. So there is a huge population, for example, in Hong Kong, where we had a lot of immigration in the 80s and early 90s. They obtain their Canadian passport, move back to Hong Kong, and pay absolutely no tax. Unlike our friends south of the border, Uncle Sam loves you forever, and you pay him tax or her tax forever. So that's a really interesting concept. And a lot of people from a tax planning perspective look at the Canadian passport and say, wow, I'm going to get it, and then I'm going to be a non-resident and live in a non-tax jurisdiction. So that's a nice advantage with respect to that. And I think I'm done, unless you have any questions. I'm happy to answer, but I've talked enough.
questo caso se la presentazione è stata sufficientemente chiara, esplicativa, possiamo procedere con l'ulteriore intervento di Isabella sugli ulteriori aspetti di doing business in Canada. Gli aspetti principali che verranno trattati sono le soluzioni di natura societarie e gli conseguenti aspetti di natura fiscale che emergono dall'ingresso e dalla gestione di un'attività imprenditoriale all'interno del Canada. Okay.
So I'm back, hello. Let's see, so we talked a little bit about CETA. We're now going to talk about entering the Canadian market. So you've heard about CETA, you've heard about Canada, you're excited about starting your business there. So we'll talk about how to do that. So the first thing I would say to look at is what is your objectives? Why do you want to be there? So is it because you want to expand your global footprint? Is it because you've heard about the tax incentives in Canada? Is it because you want to just set up a sales office? You want to start a facility there? So you need to think about what are your objectives, because that will drive the structure of the company that we set up or the way that you enter Canada. So there are basically three ways. The first one is you could basically just do your business with Canada through an import-export type relationship. We talked about that in terms of using CETA to facilitate that, and so that's one method. The second way to do it is to establish a branch presence. So a branch is an extension of your current company in Italy, but it is not a legal entity, so not a separate entity, an extension. So you essentially will be operating within Canada, but not set up a separate legal entity. Non-resident corporations that are operating in Canada are required to file tax returns and pay tax on their income earned within Canada. Generally, in order to define whether or not you have a branch, is that you have created what's called a permanent establishment. So Canada is made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. How did I get to 13? That's what they add to. So each province, each territory has its own definition of what is a permanent establishment. But generally, if you have an office, if you are hiring employees, and employees is pretty much one of the definers of having a branch, then you would have a branch. So again, a place of management, a branch, an office, a factory, hiring employees. Even if you have an agent or a salesperson that is has the authority to sign on your behalf, that could constitute having a branch in Canada or in the province that you're in. Now, the branch tax rate is higher than the regular income tax rate. So it's the regular income tax rate plus there's a branch tax on top of that ranges from 5 or 15%. And for companies that have a treaty. Now, even though you may not have to pay tax on that income, so for example, if there is a treaty that eliminates that double taxation, you still have to file those returns. The other thing is it does take a while to set up a branch. It takes 6 to 8 weeks before you can even operate to file with Investment Canada to set that up. So it is a little bit longer. The other thing is that the cost of setting up a branch to what we're going to talk about next, which is the subsidiary, which is setting up a separate legal entity, is not that much different. So I don't see that many people taking the branch route. Usually, I only see it if people want to try, well, we'll try for a year and see how this works. But a lot of what I see is people will do their research up front, they will come to Canada a few times, look at how to generate clients and contacts, and then from there usually go the subsidiary route, which is the next route. So that is a separate legal entity. You're coming in, you're incorporating corporation. Now, it's a little bit different. In the US, you're going to hear Jonathan talk about that there are different types of corporations in Canada. They might have a different extension, limited or incorporated, but they're all the same thing. And as well, there are special corporations that we use when doing business in the US, but in Canada, it's still treated as a company, a corporation. So the benefit is of a subsidiary is it will creditor protect your assets in your parent company from what is happening in Canada. So there is some protection there. The other thing is the corporation, because it is now a separate legal entity within Canada, it's taxed on its worldwide income, not just what's earned in Canada. So it's treated as a separate entity compared to the parent corporation. Tax rates in Canada range from 26.5% to 31% for a foreign health entity, so non-Canadian controlled private corporation. You'll hear the term as you start investigating what's happening in Canada. You'll hear the term CCPC, that is Canadian controlled private corporation, that is only used to describe companies that are 50% or more owned by Canadian resident shareholders. So if you have a manufacturing company and you are manufacturing within Canada, the tax rate is slightly less, it's 25%. And now, we'll talk in a minute about director requirements. So there are director requirements. Director is different from shareholder. So director is somebody who will oversee, look after the company while you're here, but not an ownership position, but still some liability issues for that person. So it's a position that needs to be considered. The other thing with a subsidiary is, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the ease of doing business in Canada, it only takes a couple of days to set up a company in Canada. What usually takes longer is the structuring, the planning on how are you going to set up that company. So one of the things that I do is I mentioned earlier our soft landing program, so we will sit down with the client, talk about objectives, come up with a structure, and then instruct the lawyers on how we want the company structure to be set up, who is going to be owning the shares, what way it will be set up. You still need to file a notice with Investment Canada, who is a regulating body on when companies come into Canada. And again, as I mentioned, if you are in a sensitive area, that's when all those reviews will be done. So again, I talked about directors' residency requirements. It's different depending on the jurisdiction that you're in. So there's two different ways, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the definition of a Canadian director is it is a Canadian citizen, ordinarily resident in Canada, or a member who's a prescribed class, but that's very specific. People will just go more to Canadian citizens, and they have to be defined under the Immigration Act. So there's two ways. There's federal or there's provincial incorporation. So federal will basically give you access. You can operate in any province as long as you file a note. You can operate in any province because the name will be cleared in each of those provinces. One thing is in Quebec, you have to be aware of some of the French language requirements. So I think one of them is if you hire more than 100 employees, you have to make sure that everything that you do is bilingual. You do have to file a notice when you decide to set up an office in each province, but you do have the right to operate across. It's not an approval process. Now, one thing about federal is you require one Canadian resident director or 25%. So that's becoming more and more of a challenge where companies are setting up in Canada, the shareholders are in their foreign jurisdiction. There are lawyers that will act, but usually what I see a lot of is they will send a director over who will then essentially become the Canadian resident director, and the lawyer will act in the interim period. Second way is provincial incorporation. This is actually a good alternative where you do not have a Canadian resident director. So some of the provinces like British Columbia, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick don't have any director requirements. So if you come into Canada and you say, I want to operate in Ontario, you can incorporate in British Columbia, which does not have any director requirements, and then file a notice to operate in Ontario. So, and then have no tax obligations in British Columbia unless you have a permanent establishment there. You do need to file notices, as I said, to operate in each. Now, one thing about this, though, is if you have for example, what was the name of that company, Lorenzo, that we passed yesterday? Technogym. I keep forgetting the name. So we passed Technogym yesterday when we were driving to our presentation. And Technogym is a name that they want to protect. They want to make sure wherever they operate, they can call themselves Technogym. So the one thing about federal over provincial registration is if you go to the federal, then you can call yourself Technogym across Canada. Whereas if you go provincial, as you operate in each province, you then have to check and do the name search. And it may be if you start in Ontario, by the time you get to operate in Quebec, then you may find out that that name's already taken. So there's ways around that and doing name searches in advance, but that's just sort of one thing to keep in mind. But there are ways to get around the requirement for the directorship, which is the provincial registration, as I mentioned. So accounting and tax compliance, we talked about the tax rate. So in Canada, you have to file corporate tax returns. You have to select a year end within 53 weeks of the date of incorporation and then file tax returns. And you have to file these tax returns even if you do not have any income. Otherwise, the government will be grading you and looking for these tax returns. So one thing about it is even if you say, well, I didn't make any money this year, I only have losses, those losses can be carried forward for up to 20 years and offset. We talked about the tax rates already, and the other thing is some of the provinces are harmonized for their federal and provincial tax returns, meaning you just file one return, whereas others will require a separate return. So for a branch, again, foreign entities, even if you have a branch, even though you don't have a separate legal entity, you are still required to file a non-resident return. And as I mentioned, even if you don't owe any tax because of provisions in tax treaties, it still needs to be filed as a requirement. I wanted to put this up because there's been some things in the news that the U.S. tax rates have been reduced. A lot of talk about that in North America. But when you take into account the provincial income tax rates in Canada and the federal tax rate combined, Ontario and Quebec are still quite competitive compared to the U.S. individual states when you take into account their state taxes. So Texas, Ontario and Quebec are second and third in terms of the tax rates for NP, taxable income, manufacturing and processing taxable income. The other thing you have to do is, so you've incorporated your company, you're ready to start, you have to apply for what are called special registrations. So a business number, it's one number that is used for all of your communications with Revenue Canada, Canada Revenue Agency. You'll hear me refer to it as CRA, so that's Canada Revenue Agency, sorry. And this business number is then used for your corporate income taxes, your HST, GST, which is our VAT system, very similar to Europe, our payroll tax system, where you're paying for payroll for your employees, any non-resident taxes that you have to pay, which we'll talk about in a little bit, as well. You also have to apply for employer health tax and workman's safety and insurance. Now, Stephen was mentioning earlier that in Canada we have free healthcare, so if I'm walking down the street and I fall, which has happened a few times, and I break my arm, someone will pick me up and bring me to the hospital and look after me, and I don't have a bill. But that cost is really carried by the large employers in Canada. So if you have a payroll of over $450,000 Canadian in Canada, there is a tax on the excess above that of 1.9% that needs to be remitted, and that's essentially how we have free healthcare in Canada. And that covers those costs. The frequency of how you file for these returns really depends on your sales volume. Now, I wanted to put this up. I had about 3 or 4 pages talking about the GST system in Canada, and Lorenzo told me to take it all down because there's a lot of words on paper. So I thought this actually explains it all. So the GST system in Canada, again, the VAT system, is based on place of supply. So where I am selling is the rate that I charge. So for example, I'm in Ontario, I'm running my business, and I'm going to sell some furniture to my customer in British Columbia. I'm going to ship it to him. So I would say, I would look at my chart and I'd say, well, the tax rate for GST in British Columbia is 5%. So that would be the rate that I charge that individual. However, if I have a customer in Ontario, I would charge them the rate in Ontario, which is 13%. Now, you'll see that there's these 3 columns there. One is GST, one is PST, one is HST. So we have a provincial sales tax system, and we have a federal goods and services tax system, which is the VAT system. And then we have some provinces that have said, we don't want to administrate both of them separately, so we are going to harmonize them into one tax. Not everybody decided to do that, but a few provinces did. Ontario, which is one of them, and it's important to note that because Ontario has one of the biggest economies in Canada and where most people look to settle. So I only need to worry about the provincial sales tax if I have a permanent establishment within that province. So I'm operating and selling within the province. So if I set up a business in British Columbia, I have an office, employees, manufacturing facility, then when I sell something, not only do I have to charge the GST, but I have to charge the PST and administrate those file returns for those separately. On the other hand, if I'm operating in Ontario, I just have one tax to administer, the 13%. Now, a lot of people say to me, this is another tax I have to charge to my customers. It is a value-added tax. You are charging it on top of your sales price, but any tax that you are then paying on, for example, if you are being charged GST on supplies, etc., that you are buying, you offset it against what you've received, and you only remit to the government the net. So everybody in Canada is used to dealing with that, so it's not really an additional amount that people are paying. It's only something for the end consumer. Did I go the wrong way? Oh, I must have skipped to that slide. That's very on the way. This is about financial statement reporting. So in Canada, we have similar to Europe, we'll have audits, we have basic reporting called notice to readers, or we have something in the middle called review engagements. In Canada, you are required to have an audit unless you have unanimous consent of shareholders. So if you have under 50 employees, if you're not a public company, and you have unanimous consent of your shareholders, you can waive the right to having an audit and just do financial statements just simply required for tax purposes. So that's just something to note. We have 2 reporting standards in Canada, either IFRS or what's called the ASPE, accounting standards for private enterprise. I see a lot of the companies coming into Canada, they will either use ASPE initially when they are just starting, But a lot of times they will evolve to IFRS because the parent company will need that consistent reporting for their global financial statements. Some other things that I mentioned earlier. So as you're trading, you've got a company operating now, and you are selling, perhaps you just are operating a sales office, you may be selling, you may be administrating some of the management for that foreign company. There are what's called transfer pricing implications. So if I'm trading with my own company in another jurisdiction, the countries involved want to make sure that the pricing that you are used is fair, and so that each country gets its own share of tax. So that is not an unusual thing. It's there are global transfer pricing rules. So if you have subsidiaries in other countries, you would be used to that already. And so we just have to make sure that it's compliant and there's certain documentation that's required. The other thing to note that I mentioned earlier is once you're profitable, you want to start taking money back, you want to start paying dividends. There are withholding taxes that the Canadian government expects, so you would be withholding taxes from that. If you take a dividend, for example, of $100,000, in Italy, the withholding tax, I believe, is 5%. So 5% is withheld, remitted to the government, and you would be taking $95,000. So that has to be remitted on that. The other thing that affects companies initially when they're starting up are the thin capitalization rules. So if you are funding that company to set up your new company in Canada, you have to be careful whether you do it by loan or whether you do it by shares, by equity. And a lot of what we will recommend is to do it through shares because you want to ensure that you don't fall into this rule of thin capitalization where if you're charging interest, that could be deemed to be income too, could be deemed to be a dividend. The other thing is certain countries in other jurisdictions require that interest be charged on loans, and so that could pull you into that rule even if you're not charging interest, so something to think about. And the final thing I thought I would note is the non-resident employees. So if you are bringing employees for several months to work or train your new employees in Canada, there are obligations to withhold tax if they are in Canada for over a certain number of days. So it's 45 days in the calendar year or 90 days if it's overlapping more than one calendar year. There are waivers and such that need to be filed as well, so that's something to note. And that's a project that we worked on with Lorenzo and with Stephen on a particular client of Lorenzo's that came into Canada to do some work. So where Stephen was dealing with the immigration work, we were dealing with filing the waivers and ensuring that there were no tax obligations. Here's something that I get a lot of people asking me questions about. So in Canada, there are a lot of incentive programs. We love to give money away to help companies grow, develop, do their research and development. So the biggest incentive program that Canada has is called the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Program, the SHRED program. It provides tax incentives to Canadian companies to advance technology that lead to either a new product, improved product materials, or even incremental changes to a product that already exists. The program offers annually $3.5 billion to 21,000 taxpayers, and 75% of these are small businesses. So small business in Canada is middle market business, $50 million to $400 million businesses in Canada are considered middle market, much smaller than in the U.S., which I think, Jonathan, middle market is up to $2 billion in a year. Do you define?
Yeah, I mean, that's what equivalent.
Yeah.
From a stock perspective.
Yeah. So most of the claims occur in commercial operations and not dedicated research labs. So companies that are operating, that are selling, these are the companies that are claiming these. And it is structured to favor small business. So the areas of science, technology, we see the manufacturing, IT, medical, chemical, food and beverage. I have a client where they make steel extrusion moldings. So they get these dies that are designed by design. And each one, even though it's by design, they then have to, so what we do is we'll do an analysis in terms of what is the best type of incentive for you to apply for. Is it a grant? Is it the shred? And then from there, we will assist you in applying. The grants also take a little bit of time. And that's kind of it for this section. Did anybody have any questions? Yes.
In the beginning of the presentation, you explained to us that you have an agent in Canada, and this agent can sign the contract, which may be identified as a permanent organization.
Yeah, you could have a branch situation.
But what about if I have an agent and without the permission of sign?
It is, we have to look at all the facts, because if you've got a sales agent and all of the authority is in Italy, then possibly not. But do you have an office there? Do you have, like, we look at all the facts in terms of determining whether or not there's a branch situation.
The situation could be an agent paid just by commission, so not without a contract. It's just a spot business we can carry out with a customer after the agent has told us it would be an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. You may, I have to look into sort of all your facts, and a lot of times when we have that situation, we will, it depends the province that you're operating in. If they don't have an authority to close the contract, you may not have that situation, but is the agent part of, they're part of the negotiation process?
No, it's just a general idea.
Oh, just a general idea.
The idea, yes, the agent will find the customer, will have the first contact, and then we can came from Italy to Canada and close the agreement.
Right.
But the agent will have
We'll just be searching for the customers. You may not unless they've got some authority, but what I would do is when you are negotiating that contract with that sales agent, it can be structured in a way to make sure that you don't have that situation that could arise. Because the risk of if you have, if you are operating in Canada and then you end up with a branch situation, because it would, let's say, define as a permanent establishment, then you could end up with filing obligations. We've seen people operating in that manner for several years, and then when we look at all the details in the contracts, it ends up that it could be defined as a branch, and then they've got filing obligations, and there's penalties for not filing. So I would, when you are entering in those types of contracts, look at it at the time that you're doing it, for sure.
If I may, I would like, and I'm going to do that in English so that we are all together. One point I wanted to stress is this is not a problem strictly limited to Canada, by the way. So whenever you approach an agent, a commercial agent abroad, this commercial agent has some contracting power. I agree with Isabella that if it does not have a signing power, then we need to look at the overall facts, but perhaps we are quite okay. But the Treaty for the Avoidance of Double Taxation and the OECD model, which is the standard model of Treaty for the Avoidance of Double Taxation, speaks clearly about that point. In terms of permanent establishment, and he says that even if there is no power of representation, formally speaking, if the commercial agent is de facto substantially negotiating the sales, but it does not execute the sale agreement, but the fact that it's substantially negotiating it is considered to be as if it had formally concluded the contract. So I agree with Isabella that this is something that we need to look at case by case on factual circumstances. Not only when you have an agent in Canada, obviously, even more importantly when you have an agent in Canada, but this applies even if you have an agent in France, England, the US, China, because this is now becoming to be an harmonized kind of legislation, particularly after the OECD latest updates with the, well, then we go too technical and I won't be continuing on this, but particularly on the OECD level, this is a legislation that has been highly harmonized now. So that is a live issue everywhere, I would say.
So it brings back to the point where we talked about at the beginning. So as you're considering entering a country, and always look at what are your, how are you planning to do it, the objectives, and then so even if it is just using a sales agent, investigate those things up front, because you don't want to be in a situation where you're operating in a country 2 or 3 years later and then it's flagged and you have some obligations and penalties resulting from not doing that. So always, as you're considering any jurisdiction, do your planning up front for sure. Any other questions? Okay, great, thank you.
Ok, thank you Isabel. Siamo in buon orario, 11:40, direi di fermarci 10 minuti per una pausa e rientriamo alle 11:50 per continuare. Abbiamo 2 altre presentazioni nel proseguo, Jonathan Grodd per gli Stati Uniti e di nuovo Isabella Bertani sulla Free Trade Agreements tra il Canada e Stati Uniti e Messico. Quindi ci fermiamo 10 minuti e rientriamo alle 11:50. Ah sì, abbiamo un coffee break tra l'altro organizzato e quindi è nell'altra stanza.
No, è proprio nell'altro qui in fondo, al corridoio.
Ah, è qui nell'altro in fondo, quindi c'è un coffee break.
A spegnere l'aria condizionata.
L'avvocato gliel'ho già chiesto prima, mi ha detto che se la spengono proprio si perde il ricircolo dell'aria. L'hanno già abbassata, adesso chiedo di alzare la temperatura ancora.
Mi fa molto piacere conoscervi, ma ho bisogno di parlare in italiano, perché tu andare agli Stati Uniti, possibilità, we'll speak in English. Okay. Right, so we've heard a lot about Canada. And Canada really is an amazing place to do business right now, especially with what's going on in the United States. Have you guys heard we have this new president? Guy, molto di pazzo, and it's making it harder on immigration. But the reality is a lot of the pushback that we're seeing is against specific nationalities and specific industries. For the most part, in our experience, people coming from Europe still have a very easy go at immigrating to the United States. The difference is that we are seeing longer processing times, more documentation required, and I think it's probably a cognate in Italian, but we need to have a more pragmatic approach. That could be you really have to really plan out what you're doing so that you can make the process easier, so that your business is not delayed, so that you can take advantage of the vast market that exists in the United States. So today, I'm going to try to avoid giving you lots of very specific details, but more try to have you think about strategy. How are you going to get your goods to market? What is the best way of doing that? So before we get into the presentation part, how many of you are planning on just selling whatever it is that you make or manufacture in the United States without an entity? So you're just going to go and sell your goods. Okay. How many of you are actually thinking about opening an office or a location in the United States? How many of you don't care about the United States at all, or just here for the entertainment value? Okay. Look at these Canadians. Okay, well, we're going to talk about all of this. So, one of the things, you will get a copy of this presentation emailed to you, so you don't have to take voracious notes or anything like that. But we have a lot of acronyms. Americans like using initials for things, especially when it comes to the various non-immigrant visas, which means temporary visas. But rather than thinking about it in terms of letters and numbers, I think it's better to think about the visa options that we have in terms of purpose. Now, when Stephen was talking, there was a lot of different options, right? But I think what is really amazing about Canada is there seems to be an option for every single situation, especially with this new free trade agreement. There's a lot more options. With the United States, for expanding businesses, it's a lot simpler because there's fewer options. So you have visas for business visitors, people that are coming temporarily, and a lot of the parameters are similar to what we talked about with Canada. Intercompany transferees, sending from a person that's worked for one entity abroad outside the United States into the United States. The one that we're going to spend a lot of time on is visas for treaty countries. And this one is very important for Italians, actually, because there's a treaty of friendship between Italy and the United States that has created a special visa option. A lot of European countries have this option as well, but not all countries in the world are able to take advantage of it. But it is really a great tool for those of you looking to invest or trade with the United States. We have professional specialty occupations, which most people coming out of study in the United States will transition into. Those are the ones that have been fraught with changes and challenges from the Trump administration. And then we have visas for those with extraordinary ability, the best of the best. Okay. So as Stephen was saying, the business visitor, the business traveler is really somebody who's coming for just meetings. And I think what we've seen before, and what I've talked to other people about, is when they come to the United States, you get nervous, right? You've traveled a very long distance, it's a long flight, you're in line to enter the U.S., and you start looking at all the different border agents. And you're like, not this guy, maybe this one, this person's just waving everybody through, I hope I get this line, this definitely not that person. And the tendency is to say, when they say, why are you coming? People say, I'm just coming for tourism. Or I'm just coming to visit. Or I want to go to Disney World. Whatever it is. But the reality is that there's a lot of activities that you can do as a business visitor. Now, ESTA, which allows you to come in for 3 months, allows for the same activities that are permissible under the B1 category. But the problem with ESTA, in my opinion, if you're looking to come for more than a couple of weeks, is that you have to make your argument to that border agent. And let's face it, after a long flight, we're not at our best, right? What you can do, if you're looking to come for a longer period of time, is actually go to the embassy or consulate and apply for a visitor visa in your passport. This will allow you to enter the United States over a 10-year period or up to 6 months on each entry. And depending on the purpose that you're using it for, it can be extended, it can be used for a longer period of time. one of my favorite uses of this visa is for an entrepreneur looking to set up a business in the United States. You can actually enter for up to 6 months, and we've been able to extend it numerous times, to meet with potential partners. Look at people that you might be hiring to operate your business in the United States. To meet with lawyers, check out locations. And one of the great things about the United States from a business incentive perspective is that most municipalities, cities, and most states are really looking for foreign direct investment. And these people will provide you with great opportunities. Lower taxes, potentially even land if you're going to be like doing a manufacturing facility. You can meet with all of these individuals as a visitor to the U.S. Okay. The other one, and this is very similar to what Stephen was saying, is you can come to the United States to do sales. If you are selling on behalf of an entity outside of the United States, and that is going to be the contracting entity, you can send a sales agent over. If you have a very specific purpose, a specific itinerary, it's good to have that information with you. It's also not a bad idea to have a letter explaining the purpose in case you get an agent that asks a lot of questions. But if you go to the embassy beforehand and say, look, we are selling our goods to the United States. This is what I will be doing while I'm there. They will give you one of these visas in your passport, and they will add an annotation at the bottom of the visa that says, this person is coming for sales. So when you get to that border agent, and they're like, what are you doing here? I'm selling goods. And they see the visa and it says, for sales purposes, they'll say, welcome to America, rather than go to this room over here and answer more questions. Similar to what Stephen said, we also have a provision that allows for services related to goods that are sold from a foreign entity if your contract specifically states that that is the purpose of the arrangement. We call it service, installation, training, and maintenance. Service, installation, training, and maintenance. If your contract has that in place, you can actually send people to the United States to do that work as a visitor. I forgot to mention this the other day, but one of the coolest examples of this actually involved an Italian company. After September 11th, the Wall Street people decided to move part of the technology over to New Jersey. And they wanted to lay a giant cable under the Hudson River, you know? The company that made that cable was Italian. And part of that agreement was that because it was so specialized that Italians had to do the installation. So 50 Italians came over as visitors to do this work because the contract for sales included installation. So it's a very powerful usage of a visitor visa. And the best part is it's not very expensive. Right? The cost of involvement is very low to get the visitor visa. So before you come to the United States and say, I'm just here for tourism, think about the purpose for which you're coming, because it might fall into one of these categories and legitimize what you are doing. More so, if you're really thinking about setting up an entity in the United States, going to the embassy, getting this 6-month visa, saying that I am going to be setting up a business, I am a prospective investor, helps the narrative, helps your story. Because when you go back to the embassy and you apply for the bigger visa, the E visa or the L, which we'll talk about in a minute, you can say, I told you I was coming here for this purpose as a visitor. We've been successful. We're now ready to start our operations. We've done all this work. We're ready to go. Which is a much easier story to tell rather than when the officer says, well, I see you came as a visitor for tourism, and now you have a business. How is this possible? So you want to keep that story straight. It's something we call like the sniff test. Does it smell like it's real? Now, this is actually what a lot of the adjudicators will do. You can have all the paperwork in the world, but if your story doesn't make sense, you will meet with resistance. And we'll talk a little bit why, under some executive orders that the Trump administration has been doing to put more pressure in place in this regard. Okay. Oops, that was the wrong one. Okay. The L1 visa is a great visa for companies that are looking to expand their operations or already have business in the United States. Essentially what it comes down to is you have an entity abroad and you have an entity in the US and they share ownership and control. And you want to transfer workers that have worked for the entity outside the United States for at least 1 year in the past 3 years. They don't have to be currently employed if they were employed abroad. And they're going to be coming to the United States either as a manager and executive or in a specialized knowledge capacity. The manager executive version of this is called L1A. And it's valid for up to 7 years. It's an initial grant of 3 years and then 2 plus 2. You get 7 in total. The L1A is a terrific visa if you're thinking about remaining in the United States permanently, if you want to get a green card, because it has a fast path to the green card. There's a special provision within the law that says if you're a manager or executive, you can get a green card more quickly. The L1B is more challenging because this term specialized knowledge is not very well defined in the immigration regulations. They actually recently had like an 18-page memo trying to explain what specialized knowledge is, and I don't think it makes any sense. The best way I can put it is the knowledge proprietary to the company? Is the knowledge proprietary to the company? So if you manufacture a very specific good, and you have a technologist who understands it really, really well, that person would be eligible for specialized knowledge. But knowledge of a third-party product, like let's say you deal with SAP for the oil and gas industry, because SAP is not your product, that would not be specialized knowledge. So you have to be very careful. There's a great story from a case I had a long time ago. There was a German company that made the doilies that sit on top of Picari at the hotels. You know, like these little things. You ever wondered, so the dust doesn't get inside, right? And they had 2 machines. And they decided to expand to the United States. So they shipped one of the machines over. Okay? They couldn't find anybody in the United States to run the machine. There was one guy in Germany, Hans. His name wasn't really Hans, but we'll call him Hans. He knew that machine like nothing else. Never went to college, had no experience, but had worked on this machine for 20 years. That's specialized knowledge because it's proprietary to the company. But if you have a PhD engineer who has only worked for your company but doesn't have that specialized knowledge, even though he's super educated, he won't qualify for this visa. So think about it as proprietary. The cool thing about this visa classification is that any nationality can use it as long as they're employed by your company. Okay? So if you have a French national working for you in Italy and you want to send them to the United States, L visa. Right? You can also use the L visa to open a new office if you want to set up a new entity, but the problem is that it's very restrictive. For a lot of country nationals, this is their only option. China, India, Brazil, Russia. You know, we discriminate in the United States, contrary to what you might be hearing. The new office is only valid for 1 year. And within that 1 year, you really have to ramp up operations. So it's very challenging to start a new business. Most people say these days to get a new business to launch, you need 3 years. You need 3 years. So this visa is saying that you have to get to a certain point of development in 1 year is hard to use. Fortunately, for Italian nationals, there's a better option. And that is the E visa. There's 2 types of E visas, and we'll talk about them both. But out of all the visas that are out there, this is my favorite. Sounds kind of geeky, but it's true because you can use it for any industry and any application. And the basis of the e-visa is that there's a treaty between the United States and whatever country. We've got that. Italy has an E2 treaty and an E1 treaty. And the other restriction is that you can only send nationals of that country. So you look at the ultimate ownership of the enterprise in the United States. If you trace the chain all the way through, and it's Italian nationals that own it, or it's traded on the Italian stock exchange, it's an Italian company in America. When you have that established, then you can transfer Italian nationals to the U.S. in either supervisory or essential skills capacity. They're similar words to what you hear with the L1A, but they're a much lower standard. And essential skills does not have to be proprietary, like with the L1B. It can just be essential to the operations of your business. This visa is really great because it provides a very long period of time in the U.S. It's issued in 5-year increments and renewable indefinitely as long as the business in the United States continues to operate. Okay? As long as the business continues to operate in the United States, you can keep getting this visa. In fact, I've had some people on these visas for 20 years. The e-visa is harder to change to a green card. That's the detriment of it. It doesn't really transition as nicely as that L1A does. But in terms of giving you a lot of time to set up and establish a business, it's the best option. It really is the best option. Now, there's 2 types. There's the E2 for those that invest. And a lot of times we'll get a question like, how much money do you need to invest in the United States to get a visa? Everybody wants to know. And if you meet a bunch of immigration lawyers, they tell stories of the lowest investment amount they've ever gotten E2 for. Like fishermen talk about the biggest fish they've ever caught. You know, I once got a visa. It doesn't really work like that. The test is actually something called substantial investment. And the way it works is whatever your industry is, the amount of money you need to establish that business is how much you need to commit to the U.S. market to get the E2. The larger the amount of money that you need to invest, the lower amount of money that needs to be committed. So for example, if you're starting a service-based business and you determine that 50,000 euros is what you need to launch the business, and really that is about the minimum that you can use it for, the government wants to see that you've committed most of that money. But let's say you want to set up a bakery in the U.S. Because remember, any type of investment can get the E2. Maybe that's 200,000 euros because you need specific mixers, you need specific ovens, it's expensive. So maybe you need to commit half of that amount of money. And let's say you want to set up a very large manufacturing facility for appliance parts or something like that. That's millions of dollars. Maybe you only need to commit 5 or 10% of that amount to the market. This is where that B1 prospective investor visa comes into play. You come over as a visitor with the intent of exploring investment. You start to make that investment. And when you're on the precipice of operations, about to begin, then you go to the embassy and you apply for your E2. And you seamlessly transition from visitor to worker, and you're on your way. The business has to have the intent to hire U.S. workers, which is a key component of this particular classification. They want to see that you're going to be enhancing the U.S. market. So normally these applications are accompanied by a business plan that talks about what you're going to be doing over the next 5 years. Now, there's another flavor of this visa called the E1. This is for a trader, import-export. Now, this used to be a much more popular visa, but the problem is not many companies only have one trade partner anymore. Because you see there's a requirement that says the trade must be principally between the United States and Italy. Most of the time, people are looking globally now. The last time the immigration laws in the United States were really changed was 1986. And because it was so long ago, some of the rules are stuck in the past. This is one of those ones that doesn't really understand global business. However, let's say that you come over on that visitor visa that we were talking about for sales purposes. And you're like, man, people really, really like our stuff in the U.S. So much so that we need to set up an entity to protect our liability abroad. We have so many products that we're selling in America, we want to limit our liability. The best way to do that is to set up an entity. And we talked about different formations before, but branches are not really good in that respect because the liability just flows through to the parent company. Typically, you'll set up a subsidiary, and then the type of formation of that subsidiary will depend on a few different factors that's particular to your situation. But if you set up an entity purely for the purposes of distribution, and that entity is purely just purchasing goods from your Italian company, now you've activated the E1. The E1, unlike the E2, does not have a requirement of you having to hire U.S. workers. All you have to have is trade that is substantial, and that can either be volume or value, depending on the good that you're selling. So if you have something that's really, really expensive, but you only sell a few of them, that will still work. Or if you're selling something that's inexpensive, you need a lot of it. But again, you can hold this visa for as long as the business is operational in the United States. On the L visa, on the E visa, spouses are allowed to work in the U.S. Unlike our Canadian brethren, we do not recognize common law marriage. You actually have to be married. Okay? And then you can't apply for the employment authorization until you arrive in the United States. Those applications used to be pretty quick, about 2 months, but with our fearless leader in power, it's now taking about 5 months because everything is slower. So you have to plan around that a little bit. Whether you're applying for an E1 or an E2, current processing times in Italy are about 90 days. It's about 90 days from when you file. So typically you're going to come over on that long-term visitor visa, stay in good touch with your attorney, and then prepare to time it so that when that 6 months is over, you're ready to go to the embassy and process the E visa or potentially the L visa, however you want. Any questions about this? Okay. One really, really, really important thing to remember is that the L visa and the E visa are both predicated on this ownership component. With the L visa, there has to be commonality of the ownership between the two entities. With the E visa, it has to be majority, more than 50% or more owned by Italians. A lot of times, especially with tech companies, people will come over to the United States in search of funding. And they will divest the shares or their interest in their business because they want to get more capital for operations. If you divest your shares below 50%, or if you sell one aspect of the business, you can lose your visa and find yourself out of status. There was once this fellow that I worked with, he was a British national, and he had a business over in the UK, and he decided to set up a subsidiary in Florida because everybody wants to retire to Miami. Okay. Anyway, he gets the business going over in Miami, and it does amazingly well. Better than the UK business ever did. And he finds somebody in the United States who just wants to buy the US business. So he sells them the US business and signs a contract to work with them for 3 years. Anyway, his visa's coming up for expiration, and I reach out to him, I'm like, yo, Nigel, your visa's about to expire. And he says, great news! I sold my business in the US for millions of dollars. I'm living the dream. I got the American dream. I said, Nigel, you're the richest undocumented worker I know in the United States. Because he lost his status by selling the business. So you gotta be a little bit careful about maintaining ownership and the nexus between the companies. Okay. These are the ones that are really problematic. And I know we don't have a ton of time, but just to kind of process it, the problem with the H-1B visa, and you might have heard about this one because this is your standard working visa for professional occupations, is that it's way, way, way oversubscribed. It's like rolling the dice. There's 85,000 of them available annually. This past year, 190,000 petitions were filed for the 85,000 spots. The year before that, it was 199,000. And the year before that, it was 236,000 for 85,000 spots. For planning purposes for you guys, it's not a good bet to make. You know, because you don't know what the outcome of the lottery is going to be. In addition, there's a lot of scrutiny played to this particular classification right now. A lot of scrutiny. A lot of these cases get requests for additional evidence. The denial rate has gone up by over 100% since Trump took office. And this is where the focus of the government's really been on contracting immigration availability. Because the view is, unlike the L visa and the E visa, which deals with foreign direct investment and job creation, they view this as something that is taking away jobs from U.S. workers. Once your business is set and established in the United States, you might find yourself in a position where you're using the H-1B to fill tech positions in particular. So you might have to use it. Hopefully there'll be different thoughts on immigration by the time you have the need to use this particular visa classification. I'm trying to be a little bit apolitical, but it's very hard. There's also some great options available for certain nationalities that you don't think of. Beyond treaties that create the E-visa, we have bilateral free trade agreements that provide special visa classifications for certain nationalities. And those, somewhat random, are Singapore and Chile have very easy visa access to the United States. Canada and Mexico through NAFTA as long as it exists. And the E3 visa for Australians. So maybe something to stash in the back of your mind. You got your business up and running in the U.S. You have a need for workers, but the unemployment rate in the United States is very, very, very low right now. It's hovering around 4%. You can look to these particular countries to supplement your workforce easily. And then also, there's always room for the best of the best. And we have visas for extraordinary ability. These are great classifications for researchers or scientists or people that have published a lot of information. So remember I gave you that example before about that German company with the doilies, and they had that big-time engineer that they wanted to hire with all the qualifications in the world. He wouldn't qualify for an L1B because it's a lower threshold for those that have extraordinary ability in artistic endeavors than they do in business or science. Okay, cool. So just to kind of put it in perspective, that's the non-immigrant visa scheme. I wanted to show you a couple things when you want to transition to immigrant visa, and that is, okay. When you come over as that multinational manager, it puts you in this first preference category. Remember how we said L1A has a fast pass to a green card? That C means current, always available. Always available. So if you're a multinational manager, you have a fast pass to a green card because you fall into the first preference. As you move down the categories, the wait times get longer. Even though right now for Europe there is no backlog, but you have to do a test of the labor market before you're able to actually pursue permanent residency. But for certain nationalities, it's really bad. India right now, if you are in this third preference, which is a bachelor's degree level education, you're processing cases that were filed in 2006. But they actually say because there's such a backlog of Indian nationals that if you started a case today, it would take 70 years, 70, for them to get their green card. I know, I'm not looking 70 years either, so don't worry. But yeah, that's how bad the situation is for certain countries. So it's kind of, that's sort of the strange thing about U.S. immigration. In the United States, we have a lot of rules for equal protection. Everybody should be treated the same when they're in the country. Immigration really treats everybody differently. And a lot of it's based on nationality. Fortunately, for Italians, you guys are, even though you're not as good as Norway, according to the president, but for Italians, it's very easy. It's still relatively easy. You know, the documentation you need is more, but the processes and the visas that are available are better than most other countries. I didn't get to talk about Justin Timberlake in his term, but we'll save that for the advanced class. There's a couple of executive orders that I actually do want to talk about. The big one is this thing called Buy American, Hire American. And this is Trump's big push to put American workers before all other nationalities. The big change, though, for Italians, honestly, is that when you go to the embassy and you apply for the visa, you will be asked the question, why can an American not do their job? And you have to be prepared to answer it. Whether it be something about your technology, whether it be about something about the plans of your company to expand operations, you have to have an answer to this question. If they ask you the question and you say, I don't know, they will deny your visa. So be prepared. That's like the big change that's come down the pipe. There's also some rules about entering with one purpose and then changing your purpose. And it's sort of a stealth change that happened, but essentially the new rule is if you come in as a visitor, let's say, and then within 90 days change your category, like you fall in love and you want to marry an American, or you want to change to a working visa, if you do it within 90 days, they can say that you committed fraud when you arrived in the country by not stating your true intention and purpose. So you have to be a little bit careful about timing now than you ever have before. It's not saying that we can't work around these situations, but you have to be very aware of timing. And the other thing is, and this is just more of a plea for what you might be hearing about in the news, or maybe what you're ignoring in the news, but the Trump administration is really pulling back on a lot of workers. And it doesn't affect you guys in particular. You know, you hear about DACA, the kids that came to the United States illegally by their parents, or people with temporary protective status, you know, from war-torn countries that are now being removed from the country. In total, there's about 1 million people in the U.S. under various levels of protected status that Trump is trying to take away their employment authorization. None of it has to do with Italian nationals per se, but a lot of these individuals are holding their low-skilled jobs. You know, 1 million people is a lot of workers. And if you're looking about expanding your business to the United States and you rely on that type of work, it's getting harder and harder and harder to find those type of workers to do those types of jobs. And unfortunately, there is no visa classification for low-skilled work. There is no dishwasher visa, there is no housekeeper visa, there is no like factory worker visa per se. So the labor market is really contracting in the United States as a result of some of our new immigration policies. So from a business operation perspective, it's something you might want to just keep in the back of your mind. So yeah, that's pretty much everything you need to know about how to strategize to enter the United States. Is there any specific questions? That means I did an awesome job. All right. So if you do have questions, we did hand out our cards. By attending this Congress, you can get a consultation and a charge if you have follow-up things or things you want to talk about specific to your situation. I know we're meeting with a couple of you this afternoon. But I guess the final message is there's always room for foreign direct investment in the United States. And if you're serious about activating the U.S. market and you want to open your business or expand your business to that market, there are lots of ways to do it. On a local, municipal level, the tax incentives are really incredible. The availability to land and other things that states are offering is almost contrary to what you're hearing from the federal government. And whilst obtaining visas is more challenging than it ever has been, as long as you have a plan, as long as you have an approach, you should be able to do it. And one of the things I think that Stephen alluded to and that I really want to reiterate is at Green Spiegel, we want to focus on you having whatever plan is you have in mind and trying to find a visa solution that fits what you're trying to do, rather than you trying to change your business to fit a particular visa. There's lots of options, both in the United States and Canada, and we hope that you take advantage of them. Thank you very much. I think we're going to hear about some cool strategies on how to leverage NAFTA and trade agreements for accessing the entire North American market next.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Sì, già facciamo l'ultima presentazione che ci dovrebbe consentire di chiudere il cerchio e l'analisi complessiva della giornata, perché Isabella Bertani ora avrà il compito di spiegarci come quindi poter a questo punto utilizzare l'ingresso all'interno del mercato canadese grazie anche al trattato di libero scambio CETA e i vantaggi che questo comporta per le imprese italiane. Ecco, come utilizzare a questo punto la presenza costituita in Canada per poter raggiungere con maggiore efficacia rispetto a quanto si potrebbe fare attraverso l'investimento diretto, i mercati degli Stati Uniti e del Messico. Quindi lascio.
So we just figured out how to use the pointer. I just figured that out. Now it makes sense. Because of you. No, it's the right way. I figured this out. So we're going to talk about, as Lorenzo mentioned, how to use CETA as a gateway into not just the United States, but into other jurisdictions. So I wanted to give you a few definitions before we start talking about things in more detail. So again, the World Trade Organization is the global international organization that deals with the rules of trade. So they have members and observers, and there's 164 members from various countries since last year, 2016. There are regional trade agreements between two or more partners, and they are, and then there are custom unions, which are trade blocs composed of free trade areas with a common tariff. So I thought that this was an interesting article that I read in The Economist a couple of years ago, and it shows how the interest in Canada has spiked over the years. One of them was when in 2008, when there was the financial collapse, and if you recall, a lot of the information in the news was how Canada had such a stable banking system. And now you can see in 2016 when Trump wins 7 out of 11 of the Republican primaries, the interest spiked up. And I wish that this article was from July 2016, so we don't have a continuation of the graph when he actually won the election in November 2016. But I would bet it was higher than that, and because I know that I had heard that our immigration lines had to be shut down since then, at the time that he won, with people interested in coming to Canada. So I thought that was neat. Sorry. Yeah, go. Okay. So trade acts and free trade areas, there are 420 regional trade agreements in force around the world. Not all free trade acts are free trade, not all free regional trade acts are free trade agreements, but they're what shape global trade. And the World Trade Organization lists 11 regional trade agreements in effect. Canada is involved in 28 agreements, and it definitely shows how they are promoting trade. They're very open to trade. So you can also, this graph here just shows again the correlation between trade and the increase in exports. So we talked about exporting before, so as the number of trade agreements has increased since 1995, so has the amount of global trade throughout the world. So these are the major trade agreements that Canada is involved in. So we had listed a number. I had said there were a number, but these are the major ones. So the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, that came into effect in January 1994. CETA, that we've discussed, that had provisional application in September of last year. There's the Canada-European Union Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, between a number of countries. It was signed in February 2016. That's the one that the U.S. backed out of. I've spoken to some people in the U.S. who think that the U.S. will go back, ask to go back into that. We'll see if that happens, because I see that with CETA and TPP, and just some other things that we talked about, that countries like Canada will become more and more competitive. The other thing that I had spoken to some people about, we were at a seminar a couple of weeks ago, where one of our bank economists was speaking, and he felt that because the U.S. had increased or had dropped its income tax rate drastically, that they didn't give enough time for that change, and it was going to result in some increased inflation in the U.S. by 2020, whereas Canada would keep its interest rates low in order to maintain its competitiveness, plus with its openness to trade. Canada, again, would be more and more likely to be a better place to do business as a long-term strategy. So that was just this particular economist's view. Another agreement that's in negotiations is the Canada-Caribbean Community Trade Agreement. As well, Canada and China have started discussions on a free trade agreement. It's in early exploratory discussions. These things take years to negotiate, so we don't have a timeline on that. So Canada as a gateway to the North American market. So to have access to the benefits of CETA, you don't need to be a Canadian-owned company. If you are a company, even foreign-owned, and you have a meaningful operation within Canada, you have access to take advantage of CETA. So it doesn't have to be Canadian controlled, and so literally by shifting its manufacturing to Canada to create Canadian origin products, a foreign company can access EU. So for example, Mexico, or sorry, let's take another one, who is not part of the EU agreement. Let's say China, let's say. They come in and they'll set a meaningful operation within Canada, and an operating company, because they're actually operating, they're producing Canadian-made goods, they can then access the benefits of CETA. So that is how other countries can access those benefits. Then by the same token, an EU company that comes and sets up its operations within Canada can access the benefits of NAFTA, but only again if it meets those native origin rules that we spoke of before. So each trade agreement is going to have its own definitions, but by coming into Canada and creating Canadian-made goods, you can then access the benefits of NAFTA through that. So that describes the gateway by moving some of your operations into the Canadian market, you can then access the trade agreements that Canada is part of. Another one is TPP. So by doing that, you can access under that. The implications of the NAFTA negotiations are going to obviously impact on how you can do that in the future, but I've got some slides to show how I think that, yes, there might be some improvements to that, those agreements or changes. I don't think that they're going to become laws. So again, you must meet those country of origin rules, and those are, remember we talked about earlier that it's your exporter that is going to help determine the origin, or that has to sign a declaration when you're doing it from when you're manufacturing in the EU to export into Canada to meet CETA. Would be the same type of thing that you need to make sure that you meet those origin rules. So, so Canada is basically covered under that. So I wanted to again talk a little bit about NAFTA and that U.S. Agreement. Nobody raised their hands when Jonathan asked if anybody was thinking about going to the U.S. So did that mean you weren't thinking about setting an operation in the U.S., or you're more interested in accessing the U.S. through other means?
They all want to go to America.
I don't know, they're still silent. So,
You can tell by their faces that the people would want to go to America.
but the trade, pardon me, the trade between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico increased 3 times since NAFTA came into effect to over $1 trillion. 387 billion was invested into Canada by U.S. investors. 463 billion invested into the U.S. and Mexico by Canadian investors. So the NAFTA partners, those 3 countries, represent 28% of the global GDP, even though it's only at 7% of the world's population. So that market, that is creating a lot of business. Here, I did want to show, I mentioned earlier why I thought that we're not going to see NAFTA collapsing. We might see some changes. But if you look at this chart, you'll see that for U.S.-Canada trade, imports and exports, the percentage shows is the percentage of that state or province's GDP relating to U.S.-Canada trade. So, I mean, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick have a significant reliance, 49, 23, 50. Alberta, 31%. But even a number of the provinces are showing 8, 9, 15, or sorry, states, 8, 9, 15%. But when you look at it from the U.S. point, from the states, in terms of who's their #1 trade partner, all the ones in dark blue have Canada as their #1 trade partner. So it's an important relationship. I think it's 39 out of 50 states that show Canada as their #1 trade partner. Oh, that's me. So did anybody have any questions? Did everybody understand that accessing, how you would access the other markets through using CETA? You have, because from now, Italy over to Canada and then import them into the U.S. You can't, because there's no trade. You can, but you'll pay the tariffs because there's no trade agreement between Europe and the U.S. And you also have to remember that those goods would not meet those made of origin because they would be manufactured in Europe. So it's always important to look at that. The other thing I wanted to mention, because I heard someone saying that they were in fashion, I think we talked about it in terms of those made in origin rules, that there are quotas relating to fashion and textiles because of the difficulties in that industry in terms of meeting those rules. But always, in terms of your industry, whether or not you're going to qualify for CETA, again, there's tariff lines that are listed on the website. And you can go in and look in, but your export broker will be able to help time in and provide the documentation, because you still have to provide that declaration in order to qualify. It's not automatic that you export and you get qualified. You have to have that declaration form to ensure that you're showing that you meet the rules of origin. Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. If you're shy, you will have my card and you can email me. And if you'd like a copy of our presentation, you can email me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. I will switch now to Italian to make a conclusive statement, and then we will have the morning completed in terms of presentations. Siamo in anticipo di qualche minuto. Volevo pertanto cogliere l'occasione per trarre ulteriormente alcune considerazioni finali. Quello che abbiamo visto in termini generali è che il Canada oggi, essendo legato da un trattato di libero scambio con l'Unione Europea, rappresenta, ovviamente in alcune situazioni specifiche nelle quali voi potreste rientrare, una soluzione migliorativa come punto d'approdo nella regione nordamericana, o come, diciamo, location nella quale costituirsi per gestire il mercato nordamericano. Per quale ragione? Perché abbiamo nella geografia nordamericana 3 paesi importanti e 3 mercati importanti, che sono quelli degli Stati Uniti, quello del Messico e quello del Canada. Ora, è sicuramente vero che ognuna delle vostre aziende potrebbe gestire investimento diretto all'interno degli Stati Uniti, del Canada o del Messico. E in effetti ci sono molte delle aziende che oggi operano localmente che sono già presenti in questi mercati, anche in tutti e 3 o in alcuni di questi. Ma il ragionamento che abbiamo cercato di fare è che probabilmente alla luce di questo nuovo trattato, se ci sono tutte le condizioni che ce lo permettono, la strategia potrebbe essere quella di costituire una presenza in Canada. Ipotizziamo che la presenza debba avere anche funzione produttiva, oltre che distributiva, per tutta la regione nordamericana. Ipotizziamo che la produzione necessiti comunque di componentistica proveniente dall'Europa o dall'Italia. Ecco allora che la strategia potrebbe essere quella di costituirsi in Canada, importare tutta la componentistica dall'Europa o dall'Italia. Questo ci consentirebbe di importare la componentistica e di acquisire i servizi con tutte le facilitazioni del trattato CETA, sia per quanto riguarda l'abbattimento delle tariffe che per quanto riguarda eventualmente la facilitazione con la quale riusciamo ad acquisire servizi provenienti dall'Europa o la facilitazione con la quale riusciamo a trasferire risorse personali strategiche che poi sono preposte a fornire dei servizi a supporto dello sviluppo delle attività manifatturiere in Canada. Una volta arrivati in Canada e iniziato il processo produttivo, nella maggior parte dei casi noi saremo nella condizione di poter soddisfare la cosiddetta regola d'origine del trattato, dei trattati NAFTA e dei trattati che legano il Canada con gli altri paesi del Nord America. Quindi nella prima fase, diciamo, di costituzione in Canada e importazione dei componenti andiamo a sfruttare principalmente il trattato di libero scambio CETA per l'importazione dei componenti con abbattimento o azzeramento dei dazi doganali, e lì utilizziamo le regole di origine tipiche del trattato CETA. Se importiamo componenti dall'Europa e abbiamo prodotto questi componenti in Europa o comunque i componenti soddisfano la regola di origine in Europa, noi avremo la possibilità di importare questi componenti in Canada con quelle facilitazioni che vi dicevo. Il processo produttivo direttamente in Canada dovrebbe consentirci utilizzo condizionale, perché dipende ovviamente dalla merceologia nella quale voi siete, dalla tipologia di prodotto che gestite, dal processo produttivo che implementate, però nella maggior parte dei casi dovrebbe poterci consentire di soddisfare un'altra regola di origine, che è quella che consente al prodotto manufatto in Canada di poter entrare nel territorio statunitense o nel territorio canadese con un'altra esenzione o riduzione tariffaria daziaria, che è quella prevista appunto all'ingresso negli Stati Uniti o in Messico. In quel caso i trattati di riferimento saranno quelli sottoscritti tra Canada e i paesi nordamericani, Stati Uniti e Messico, e utilizzando questi trattati, il principale dei quali è il NAFTA, potrei riuscire a commercialmente servire un territorio, Stati Uniti o Messico, facendo ovviamente entrare un prodotto che è manufatto in Canada, che ha la regola d'origine che mi consente di commercializzare il prodotto manufatto in Canada negli Stati Uniti e nel Messico a dazio ridotto o a dazio azzerato. Cosa che probabilmente non riuscirei a fare se continuassi a produrre in Italia e a vendere negli Stati Uniti, anche perché ci sono, come vi dicevamo, queste politiche protezionistiche di Trump che dovrebbero in futuro rendere più difficile la penetrazione commerciale di un prodotto nel territorio statunitense, di un prodotto manufatto in Italia, mentre invece queste politiche protezionistiche di Trump tendono a fare che cosa? Ad incentivare l'impresa italiana ad entrare negli Stati Uniti e a gestire un'attività imprenditoriale all'interno degli Stati Uniti, perché in quel caso effettivamente si riuscirebbe a sostenere che il prodotto non è più importato dall'estero, ma è manufatto all'interno degli Stati Uniti. Però laddove non sia possibile o non sia strategico per voi entrare direttamente negli Stati Uniti per un processo produttivo, e quindi laddove doveste continuare a vendere il prodotto manufatto in Italia o in Europa direttamente negli Stati Uniti, una valida opzione potrebbe essere quella appunto di gestire la produzione per la regione nordamericana direttamente dal Canada, beneficiando di questi vantaggi che diversamente non riusciremo a conseguire con vendite dirette. Ultimo punto da considerare è che il Messico è sicuramente un mercato nel quale abbiamo visto molte imprese, anche locali, si sono costituite per svolgere un'attività produttiva. Molte volte abbiamo visto che molte imprese locali si sono costituite in Messico anche per seguire la propria committenza principale, perché esistono clienti magari di riferimento per alcune vostre aziende che vi chiedono di seguirle in qualità di fornitori. Allora in quel caso ovviamente la strategia cambia, perché vado al seguito di un mio cliente principale che mi chiede di costituirmi specificamente all'interno di quel paese, e abbiamo visto che il Messico molte volte ha rappresentato questa destinazione. Tuttavia all'interno del Messico non dobbiamo dimenticare che permangono rischi geopolitici, culturali, sociali, anche se poi magari possiamo trovare delle condizioni, soprattutto per quelle lavorazioni labor intensive, di favore, perché sicuramente i costi sono più bassi rispetto a quelli che abbiamo in Italia o che potremmo avere negli Stati Uniti o in Canada. Tuttavia, ecco, tutte queste considerazioni vanno valutate, vanno ponderate per poter poi addivenire ad un piano strategico che, laddove possa riconciliare questi fattori che dicevamo, potrebbe vedere ora, grazie al Trattato CETA, il Canada come punto d'approdo per poi gestire il mercato nordamericano. E questo direi è un po' lo statement con il quale volevamo lasciarvi a conclusione delle presentazioni e dei lavori di questa mattina, fermo restando che ci piacerebbe ovviamente poter rispondere a tutte le domande e dubbi che nel frattempo, nel corso della mattinata, ascoltandoci, dovreste aver maturato, elencato, annotato. Qualora non dovessero esserci, ovviamente siamo pronti a dare corso agli incontri che abbiamo già pianificato, durante i quali ovviamente cercheremo di rispondere alle vostre necessità. Domande? Perplessità? Considerazioni? Siamo nell'ambito di una tavola, non è rotonda, è un po' meno rotonda, però il concetto è quello, cioè il concetto era quello di avere un consesso intimo nel quale poter dar voce principalmente a voi.
Volevo fare una domanda?
Prego.
Dunque, allora, premetto che siamo un'azienda raccogliendo informazioni sul mercato statunitense, quindi siamo ufficialmente presenti. Siamo presenti, ma nella realtà come siamo chiusi. Allora, quello che abbiamo capito è che è strettamente consigliata una presenza di una sussidiaria negli Stati Uniti per facilitare una serie di processi. Allora, sfruttando il discorso Italia, Canada, CETA, Canada, Stati Uniti, NAFTA, e quindi aprendo una sussidiaria in Canada, è altrettanto strettamente consigliato avere anche una sussidiaria negli Stati Uniti, o si può bypassare?
Potrebbe essere comunque consigliato. Facciamo così, posso rifrasare la domanda in inglese così mettiamo tutti, oppure voi... Ok, we just rephrase the question just to allow everybody to understand. The gentleman was saying, we as a company have an interest and have a kind of presence in the United States. We understand that the market requires to have a subsidiary or a structured presence in the States as a way of establishing yourself and doing business in that country. The question is, having listened to the presentation and understood the advantages that now Canada is presenting, would I be able to establish my presence through a subsidiary in Canada and then avoid having to establish a second subsidiary in the United States for doing business in the United States? This is basically the question. Jonathan, you want to?
Yeah, first. The issue that you're going to face is that you're going to have the same immigration problems for people coming to the United States. So you can use Canada as a base, but then you're going to have to rely on that visitor visa to come and do your sales operations. Ultimately, I think there's a number of advantages from ease of movement of people, taxation, taking advantage of the free trade, as Isabella presented at the end. The big problem is that a lot of sales are based on relationships. And if you don't have that constant ability to be next to your clients that you're targeting in the US, the tax savings that you are going to make are not going to outweigh the cost and hassle of setting up a subsidiary. Certainly, as an entry strategy to test the market, proceeding that way is not a bad idea. But ultimately, if you find yourself with an increasing market share in America, the need to establish a subsidiary or potentially a branch of the Canadian entity in the United States, I don't think can be eliminated completely.
It's just from the point of view of the client, because we know that if, for instance, if I can within the USA and I present myself, I find an interested client. If I present my visa, oh, you are from England. I like your product, but you are too far for me. So,
the problem
is the same if I present myself from Canada?
The problem
you're from Canada, you are for Canada,
May
you are
I
too far
ask,
from me.
what are you selling? What is your product?
Paid.
Paint?
Yeah.
Yeah. The problem
So you are kind of
the bigger problem I think you're going to face is actually the contractual agreement between the U.S. client and the Canadian entity, less about reputation and location, because your contractual agreement most likely will not be under U.S. law. So if you're looking at big sales, the clients are going to be detracted because it's going to be hard for them to litigate if there's a problem. Americans like to litigate. Yeah. It's true. But I mean, if you're talking about clients and if they see that they have to sue you in Canada if there's a problem or their contract is under Canadian law, that's going to be a disadvantage to you. Certainly being in the same time zone is beneficial. But, you know, for Canadian companies, they often start by selling from Canada and then ultimately migrate down a subsidiary once the enterprise is large enough to support it.
Yeah, they do it. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not possible. I mean, I have a number of clients that are, a couple in particular from Italy that have their base in Canada and then they are exporting to the US to South America. I think it depends on the product, and I think it depends, as Jonathan has said, on the client relationship. So if you have established relationships, then it may be easier than if you don't, because I would add that if you're having to put in salespeople in various states to generate those sales, then that could create a nexus anyway. But you know, it doesn't mean it's not possible. I think it depends on the product. Like as I said, we have a number of clients that are doing just that establish themselves in Canada and are just exporting to the rest of the North American market and South American market. Or would you add?
You know, we've moved many companies to Canada to start their footprint there and test the Canadian market and test the American market. And then, as Jonathan said, if business progresses, at that point you would look at how would I enter into the United States in a more formal way. But I think it's very important, if that is your plan, then you get the proper documents in line for that future event that you're talking about. So, you know, I would look at that way.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Many companies are doing it now because they're not sure of what's happening from a business perspective in the U.S. So we're a little more stable. So people are coming, they're saying, okay, we will be in Canada, it's stable. We will definitely go to the U.S. to try to reach the markets because their markets are huge compared to us. And then once things become a little clearer in the States, that may take another 6 years or may only take another 2 more years. So you'll have to see with regard to that. But that's what we find. And the company that we moved to Canada recently was a U.S. company. And they're just concerned with, from a business perspective, they want consistency. And they're not sure what's happening yet. So they say we're a little more consistent in Canada. We see the transparency, it's clearer in Canada. We still have to have a very strong presence in the United States, but we're so close that it works out. I mean, you know, our international airport in Toronto, we service almost every major port in the United States as far as airports, things like that. So in transportation, I mean, it's much easier nowadays.
Altre considerazioni, altre domande? Bene. Allora, abbiamo completato i lavori con qualche minuto di anticipo e mi sembra che gli incontri sono già pianificati, quindi chi ha prenotato l'incontro ha ricevuto ieri anche una comunicazione con l'orario e quindi direi sospendiamo un'ora. Il primo incontro ce l'abbiamo
alle 14:30.
alle 14:30, quindi sospendiamo per un'ora e poi ci rivediamo qui in questa sala, ci accomoderemo nei tavoli alla fine della sala e gestiremo gli incontri con coloro che hanno prenotato gli stessi. Quindi grazie.
Or breakfast in John. It was happening in Italy. And we would like to know, we are already working in both Canada and the USA. And we have several distributors there. And, our issue is, are these set agreement cancelling all the duties and taxes from the Canadian side, the one we are importing, or something still going on this side? Because some customer of ours, our last shipment asked for a kind of certificate of origin, but until now was not that.
Yeah, because that's for CETA.
It's for CETA.
That's for CETA. So what happens is, as I was explaining to you, your exporter from here has to prepare the certificate of origin to show, because then from there they know whether or not you have to be charged the duty. So you're going to get that between Italy and Canada, not on shipments to the U.S. No, the exporter. Do you have an exporter of record? Who's exporting for you?
It depends, because sometimes we're using water to Canada, sometimes they are export shipments, so it's to our customers. So I would like to know which is the entity who's issuing this kind of.
It's usually who's handling your customs, your actually exporter. Yeah, exactly.
Is there a certificate, let's say, that is valid for all the customs office you go to, or it's at each time you're going to export?
That I'm not sure, you know? That I'm not sure.
I only do immigration,
Because
sorry, I don't deal with that.
I think that it has to, I think it's per shipment, because you could be shipping different things. So I think it's based on your shipment and your goods, but they'll be able to answer that question for you. Are you just doing distribution? That's all you're doing right now?
We have just several customers. We have a few customers buying directly from us, and we have several distributors that are not doing big volume, let's say, that are expanding market for us.
Right. And the distributor is not handling the exporting, you're doing it for you're doing it. So I would say go to the customs office first. And then they can answer those questions about whether there's a blanket one for a certain type of goods. There may be, that I don't know. But it's the exporter that handles the certificate of origin. Because then that will determine whether or not your tariff is reduced. You're paying duties now?
Just the export one, because sometimes we do with a VAT shipment, then it means we have only the export duties to be paid. Instead, our importers, our customer pays for all the duties.
That's why the customers are now asking for you, because they're trying to see if why are we paying duties if there's CETA, right? So that's why they want you to get the certificate. And even for you, well, you're paying, you can get they may be able to reduce them or eliminate them, depending on what is your product again? Die-cast aluminum. So I don't think there's an exclusion for that. So probably most of the tariffs have been removed. But there's a whole schedule.
So what you have to do is find someone who can give you the certificate of origin, and then you'll be fine.
Yeah. So the customs.
And you're going to have that from everybody now who's going to be buying from you from Canada.
If they're paying the duties, right? But otherwise, he said that they're paying the duties, and then you shouldn't have to pay them if you're not.
And you may also be in an issue if you've sold any products since September last year. You may even get that money back, right? Say, sorry, here's my origin certificate. I shouldn't have paid it. Can I have my money back? That's what I would do. Right.
Yeah. So whether there's a blanket or whether it covers, whether you have to get one for each type of goods, that they can answer all those questions.
Another question that we had that you already answered this morning when you use presentation transfer
Yeah,
just
somebody else had that question. You're shipping from Canada to the US. If someone else was shipping from Canada to the US and then, sorry, from EU to the US and then to Canada, so they were paying the tariffs, you can get away from that. Whereas if you-
And it may not make a difference as of Friday, because the United States may put a tariff on Canada, so we'll find out.
Yeah.
On aluminum.
Yeah.
On Friday.
So, and if there's if you go EU to Canada, then there'll be no, that's where you get it. Because that's what you're covered under. There's no trade agreement between US and Europe, right?
But which are the, processes that should be accomplished in Canada to, for instance, for our products, is enough to assembling the products or just for packaging or all the
No, it's
production
about,
products,
well,
should
it's
be there?
where your goods were manufactured, where they were brought. But again, it is a whole schedule, and for aluminum, I'm not sure if how far that, like where the origination starts, so.
What you have to do is you have to hire someone who can, first of all, that certificate that we talked about. And then you have to ask someone, based on your products, how would you be able to get a certificate of origin once it's in Canada if you're assembling something? And then you can make that decision. So maybe you can find him someone to do that. I don't do that, but that's what you do.
Well, you're not assembling in Canada right now. No, you're doing everything in Europe. Yeah, so in Europe, we can see if Lorenzo can find us somebody. And then in Canada, we can handle it, but
At the moment, we don't have enough volume
to do that there.
have a subsidiary company there.
Yeah.
Sometimes the market will be bigger.
Yeah. I mean, sir, do you have do you know where do you have a customs office that you deal with?
Not directly there, but several customer offices, we're dealing according to the customer we're working to. Sometimes we work in one area, sometimes
Yeah, but I think for your shipping out, you have to find someone here because it's the exporter of record that has to get you. So I'll check with Lorenzo if he's got a contact for you. Yeah, for sure.
You said that there are some trial of agreement between China and Canada for.
It's just in discussions right now.
Okay.
It's early discussions. It will be years before they come up with an agreement. So right now they're going to be.
Are there duties to import from China at the moment?
Yeah, from between China and Canada, yes. I don't know the amounts for your type of goods. I don't know. Again, we can.
Is this going to be a general agreement or for that specific?
I don't know. They're still discussing it. When they're in discussions, it's very early. Like it's early. They don't disclose that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I work in production and in organizing the horizons, and I had all my question answered during this morning, so I don't have anything to.
Last question. The taxes for having a stock in Canada is high. For instance, we know that for countries like California, we have very huge taxes for having.
Just for holding the stock?
Exactly, for holding stock.
Well, you would have a permanent establishment if you have your people running that warehouse. And so you would have, if it's just a presence, you would have, as I mentioned to you before, it's a branch tax on the income produced, or if you're a subsidiary, it would be the subsidiary tax that I discussed with you. Just for holding the inventory, no. No.
For instance, for us establishing a warehouse in the US would be very difficult because they have very big taxes on all the stock, and it's a very fragmented market. So it's not easy to scale everything and to put all the items there. But for the Canadian one, for instance, it should be a little bit lower, it also would be reachable to go in the US. But not imply at the moment
Yeah.
to pay tax on interest. So that's all for future citizens, let's say. It's enough.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out by email.
Perfect. Great. Thanks for your time.
Have
a good day.
Oops, ciao.
Are we meeting with that group?
Our production is total for road, so we don't sell usually, especially in the department of machinery. We export in Emirates, North Africa, Russia, Europe, but not yet in America, not yet in North America, and not yet in South America. We are really interested in North and South America, but we are a small company. We have just 13 employees. And so we know that it's not easy for us to think to open a company in USA or Canada. So probably after this day, after this meeting, and also after our private analysis, we understood that for us, I think it's better to find any distributors or any partnership, maybe, even if probably the
part of a bigger group, and it's surely a reputed company with already outstanding operations abroad. So we are very happy to have you here and keen to listen.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Thermovat is a company which was born in 1952. I'll make it short.
Okay.
Make it short. But,
you don't have to sell anything.
You're
not selling it.
I like the history. The year was 1952.
I'll make it short. Yesterday, then. No, the company was born in Milan. We produce components, electromechanical components, heating elements and thermosters for domestic appliances, commercial, and lately also industrial applications. We are part of Ariston Thermo Group. Maybe you can source the information about Ariston Thermo Group. Thermovat is a group inside of the mother company itself. We produce not just for the consumption of the heating elements and thermostats inside the group, but we serve mainly, more than 80%, the consumption of competitors of Ariston Thermo, of the mother company. We work in more than 100 different countries. So we are a global company. It's a classical local company. We are local because we tend to be closer and closer to our partners, especially the major partners. But we are global. We produce more than the 75% of production in Italy, in our plant of Arcevia, which is 20-something kilometers far from here. And we export everywhere. It's a strongly oriented company. We have one more plant in the northern part of Italy, one greenfield which is starting actually in these weeks in Serbia. Why Serbia? Many reasons. No, it's low, cheaper cost of labor, but also a peculiar relation with the Russian. With
Free
the
trade
Russian
agreement.
free trade agreement with the
That's
Russian.
the same concept than CETA.
Exactly. One more company in Dubai where we make
That's a branch office actually. We make pre and post sales activities there. All of them are run by the company, of course, the same ownership, which is Mr. Merloni himself. And one since
it's still a family business.
Is a still family business run by managers, but is a family business because
The ultimate owner of the company is an Italian national or an Italian family.
Is an Italian fellow, 50 years old this year. And we report directly to him because of the peculiarity of Thermo. But since we sell to competitors. One more company.
And the group overall is over 1 billion, right?
1.7.
1.7 billion.
That's amazing. That's a really
1.7 something.
big family-owned business.
Yeah.
These historically were
a little bit
producing, selling units with a value of less than 3 euros.
Oh my God, that's a lot of units.
It's also
We're into
interesting
that
that you sell to the competitors as well.
The majority. So the strategy division, which is now
And
more
more
plants
plants
in China, in Wuxi, Jiangsu province.
A subsidiary also, or just a
No.
brand subsidiary?
No, it's a manufacturing company there. And from China we serve Korea, mainland China, Vietnam, and Malaysia. The vision is the following. Since a few years, the company, we tried to approach, actually a few years back, with a merger, M&A project, but the project was not really the one we were looking for. The company was a multinational company with a strongly production base in Mexico. But for the same reasons that you mentioned today, most of all the social impact was really high. So we can automatize the production, we can spend a lot of effort in industrialization, in cost saving, lean production system. We are strongly oriented since ever to the lean manufacturing. But the location, the region there was the impact of Mexico without any prejudice was very strong. So at the end, what we say, okay, we skip it. Now the company is led us to 2 acquisitions in less than 1 year and a half. One in Canada, the first one in Canada, in Saint John.
The first flag in the North American market.
They produce.
And the wind is very good to go on the East Coast.
Good wind, good winter there.
What's the name of the Canadian company? Would you say ET?
Is NTI.
It was HTC in the US?
HTP in New Bedford. New Bedford, which is in just 1 hour from Boston, southern than Boston.
We have an office near there, in Providence.
Well, it's probably.
No, it's East Boston.
It's near Boston, but it's actually like
Yeah,
here's
it's
Boston,
almost-
here's Providence, it's like New Bedford.
So is it NY Thermal?
No, it's NTI.
NTI.
It's
Write
NTI.
down
How
NTI
many,
boilers.
NTI boilers or
Okay.
NTI Ariston.
Got it.
You may.
How many
Employees?
employees at the facility in the United States?
It's about, in the States, it's about 80. There they produce, about 100, yeah. Roughly 100. They produce electrical boilers and gas boilers, sorry. They have 2 facilities in nearby.
So you're saying that there were 2 acquisitions in Canada, or
Yeah.
one? Yeah.
One in Canada, one in the US.
Oh, one in Canada, one in the US.
Okay. The vision we have is, again, we have to support the company for sure, but we have also to scout new prospects for our external sales. So the approach is, for now, for the time being, we will start not only to sell to the companies of the group there, and we are starting in this month. But also to scout, we already started to approach competitors of the group, and it's fine. I mean, we opened already a pipeline with the projects customized, tailor-made for them, both in Canada and in US. The vision is not to be there with an export operation only. If we have to be there, we have to be there with a local, as well as what we did in China, as well as what we did in Europe.
And because of the automation and lean manufacturing that you've created, it's economically viable to manufacture in country.
Consider that the difference.
If it's all automatized,
everything, the impact of the transport is very negligible. It's really negligible.
Okay.
And
And it's lightweight.
no, the weight is 300 grams. It's not that much.
Yeah, that's what I mean, that's why it's easy to transport. Yeah.
You can compact the two totals.
But to serve B2B companies producing water heaters, you have to be really close to the partners. So the idea is to scout companies, okay, in the same business, not to go on a greenfield,
Yeah.
because there are about 110 competitors producing similar product of what we produce there. Out of these 110, we made a short list, we made a second short list, we made a third short list. We came up with some, we made a cherry pick. We came up with some names, and now after that we will have to speed up. We are running also one more acquisition this year in Europe, but on a parallel way we will have to open a project also in the North American territory.
And have you limited to the city or where you are looking, or not yet?
Not yet. But we need to be close to Michigan state or the area of the big lakes, because the majority of our customers might be there.
And you are looking at actually setting up manufacturing or just distribution there?
No, manufacturing.
So then my suggestion to you would be the following. Once you've done your sort of preliminary, if you're saying you're looking at Michigan, you may want to look at the border towns in Ontario, around there. Once you've come down to where you want to go, then all of us can reach out and put you in touch with people that are responsible for direct investment and really put on a whole seminar for you for a day, answer questions about, cost of employees, cost of space, cost everything, so then you can make a logical decision.
Are you?
Sorry. Just you are not working with Ariston Channel, are you?
We have done something in the past, but we are not in direct relation now.
Because it is not. I'm in charge for the sales, so my colleagues for the legal affairs department and MMA department, they are running this business.
I was gonna ask. You went through the 110 prospects. You've already approached some of them, or you're in the process of approaching?
No.
You're just
scouting.
You're just scouting. So do you need help with that process? In terms of no, because it sounds like you've got your own.
That is going to be a list of the target companies for acquisition.
Yeah.
In addition to the ones that you already have, in view of increasing your portfolio of clients.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stephen in terms of once you've figured out the region, then we can connect you with I know with RSM, you were saying you even went to one of our seminars in one of the other offices in Dubai. We've got, I don't know how many offices in the US, so we can connect you with our local office there. At the same time, I know that we have a whole manufacturing group that would be happy to sit down with you now to talk to you about just in general the different regions and
There might
give
be
you
some
some
additional
overall
interest in the
information.
northeast in New England.
Yeah.
There might be a couple of new names do remember.
Mhm.
And again, because of the proximity effect, the proximity to our end customers, it could be, on the contrary, it would be convenient to be to Michigan or Ontario area.
So just in terms of where you are now, how would you like, how do you see that you'd like us to help you in just in terms of?
It was just a preliminary introductions. I
Yeah.
don't have not even an idea of
Yeah.
what my colleagues might require later on.
Because we can even on just the M&A side, I was asking you if they'd had a process already or if your internal team was doing, because we even can help target companies if you need help in that process. We have a whole, we basically have a buy and sell side that can help connect you. We're also very involved in the private equity market in the U.S. and Canada, where there are PE firms looking to sell companies where they have ownership in. So there, even on a preliminary basis, there's ways to try to.
And I think the overall message, since we fully understand that the process is likely to be handled by the legal department,
Yes.
because that's the mother company.
Yeah.
So we understand that, but perhaps a message that you could consider sending out to the legal department is that while the legal department of this big multinational, they tend to use big branded law firm or accounting firm, that is primarily for backing up their liability in terms of decision-making people. We are structured, we as a group, we as smaller firm kept together by daily relations and operations. We are as efficient as they are in terms of scouting or assisting the transactions. Probably we are much more efficient in terms of contacts because they have direct relations with the government and with all the other institutions, but we can very well be much more efficient in terms of costs, because we have different structures, different overheads, and we can be much more competitive and fast, if you wish, in terms of execution.
This could be a turning point. Well, I'm not aware, because as I said before, it's not part of the perimeter that I'm in charge. I'm not aware of the way the two former operations have been run so far. For sure, in case of Thermowat itself, the company will ask us also some advice, as when being the one who is leading the project of North America. And, the idea was to be, again, to find a partner which is, again, local. No?
Yeah, right.
We like the expression, we like the idea to be here and there.
Well, we talked about the visas earlier today, so there's no need to rehash that. But one thing you might want to look at with your U.S. entity is the compliance on the visa stuff. Unlike Canada, which does have some aspects of compliance, currently the U.S. government is very aggressive about investigating companies to ensure that the paperwork for all the employees is in order. So a lot of times when we have a merger and acquisition situation, they'll do due diligence on a variety of different factors, but they don't necessarily look into the immigration component. So that's one thing you might want to talk to the person responsible about in the United States. There's certain forms that have to be completed for every single employee. Even paperwork violations can range into the thousands of dollars for violations. So that's typically something that's overlooked a little bit when a European is making first acquisitions in the United States. That might be something that's worth exploring.